Being wealthy in Victorian society seems from the outside like a dreamy existence. Servants smoothing your sheets, meals appearing like magic, drives through manicured parks, and every inconvenience whisked away by someone paid specifically to care that you never felt inconvenience at all. But the great joke of Victorian high society is this: the richer you became, the less your life belonged to you. Comfort was yours, absolutely, but rest, relaxation, freedom, those were luxuries reserved for people who didn't need to impress anyone. The good news? You're rich. The bad news? You're never off duty. Not even in your sleep, because even dreaming too loudly might be interpreted as a sign of undisciplined mind and weak character. Before we step into the drawing rooms and privileges of Victorian wealth, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're joining this story of status and society. To be wealthy in the Victorian age was to live inside a theatre where the performance never stopped. Not because the curtains couldn't close, but because society refused to install curtains in the first place. Every gesture was examined, every decision interpreted, every absence explained, every smile measured. You were expected to move through the world like a polished example of what money should look like. That meant speaking elegantly, dressing impeccably, conversing confidently, hosting flawlessly, walking gracefully, standing nobly, and never, under any circumstances, giving the impression that you were tired, overwhelmed, or in any way shaped by your physical body like an ordinary mortal. Relaxation was something you performed, not experienced. When you sat with a book near the fire, the goal wasn't comfort. It was to show others that you had the time and education to sit with a book near the fire. And this pressure didn't only come from society at large. Much of it came from within your own class, the very people who smiled at you in public and critiqued you in private. The wealthy monitored each other with the dedication of unpaid detectives. Your absence from a ball? Commented on. Your presence at the wrong event? Commented on harder. Your shoes slightly behind the leading edge of fashion? A quiet tragedy. Your hairstyle a week late in the trend cycle, a social misdemeanor. Relaxation didn't mean you weren't performing, it meant your performance had to be executed with greater subtlety. Even family events, supposedly intimate, personal moments, were stage-managed. Hosting a dinner with relatives wasn't a chance to unwind, it was a chance to demonstrate that your family was thriving, unified, refined, and entirely free of scandal. Your children were reminded not to fidget because fidgeting suggested poor upbringing. Your spouse was reminded not to appear bored because boredom suggested disinterest in the family's social mission. You were reminded not to laugh too loudly because laughter carried connotations of impulsiveness. Yes, wealth granted you an estate. It just didn't guarantee you emotional volume control. And then there were daily routines, which wealthy Victorians executed with a seriousness that modern people reserve for job interviews. You didn't simply wake up, you performed waking up. Stretching was elegant, rising was dignified, dressing was ceremonial, breakfast was a social check-in, reading the newspaper was a demonstration of cultivated worldliness. Even stepping outside was a declaration of your status. You needed to look composed, calm, and unbothered by the small inconveniences that plagued poorer people: rain, wind, temperature, gravity. Your schedule was not yours to shape. Invitations dictated your weekends, obligations shaped your afternoons, and duties you never chose arranged your evenings. You were expected to appear at social gatherings not because you enjoyed them, but because absence suggested decline. Decline in wealth, decline in health, decline in marriage, decline in everything that mattered. The irony, of course, was that many wealthy individuals longed for precisely what their money couldn't buy: an unobserved moment, a quiet hour, a day where no one asked anything of them, a morning without layers of silk, starch, etiquette, and expectation. Even sitting down came with strings attached. You could sit in the parlour, but only with the right posture. You could walk through your rose gardens, but only with the right pace. You could read poetry, but only from appropriate authors. You could travel, but only to destinations that reflected cultural refinement rather than frivolity. Everything you did had to reinforce the idea that your wealth wasn't accidental, that you belonged in the upper ranks because you displayed the correct habits of superiority. If you enjoyed an activity too casually, it looked suspiciously like pleasure, and pleasure to the Victorian upper class had to be justified, supervised, or thoroughly disguised. And this is the essence of Victorian wealth: comfort wrapped in performance, privilege wrapped in pressure, luxury wrapped in expectation. You lived an easier life than almost everyone around you, but easy is not the same as free. You didn't shovel coal, but you shoveled social obligations. You didn't fear hunger, but you feared humiliation. You didn't labour physically, but you laboured socially, daily, endlessly, without holidays, without overtime pay, and without the ability to call in sick, because calling in sick implied weakness, and weakness implied decline, and decline implied failure. The Victorian wealthy were comfortable, yes, but rested? Absolutely not. Rest required privacy, autonomy, and freedom from judgment. 3 things wealth in this era promised but rarely delivered. You lived well. You just didn't live relaxed. After all, what good is money if not to keep you tensely, committed to proving you deserve to have it? A wealthy Victorian's home was not simply a place to live. It was a massive, unblinking announcement system. Before anyone heard your voice, met your family, or tasted your over-elaborate dinner menus, they saw your house. And your house had one job: to declare to the world, loudly and with no trace of humility, that you ranked high enough in society to require an unnecessarily large building just to exist in. It wasn't built for comfort. It was built for admiration, intimidation, envy, and the occasional person fainting at the sheer number of staircases. The exterior alone had to perform like a trained show horse. Tall windows, preferably too tall to clean without a ladder and a prayer, stone facades, columns that supported nothing in particular, they all signalled wealth. Even the chimney layout mattered. Multiple chimneys meant multiple fireplaces, and multiple fireplaces meant multiple rooms, and multiple rooms meant you were wealthy enough to own rooms you may never set foot in. The Victorian ideal wasn't a home that meets your needs. It was a home that suggests your needs are so extensive that only a mansion can contain them. Of course, maintaining such a house required more effort than living in it. The gardens alone were a relentless performance of prosperity. Your lawn had to be expansive enough to demonstrate you weren't using the land for anything vulgar like growing food. Your flower beds had to bloom in precise patterns, as if nature itself understood Victorian social hierarchy and politely cooperated. And heaven forbid a guest spotted a weed. A weed wasn't a plant. It was a personal attack. If your gardener missed one, it suggested you were slipping socially. After all, truly important people never let nature express itself without supervision. Inside, the performance intensified. Every room had a designated message it was supposed to deliver. The entrance hall said, "Prepare yourself. The wealth increases from here." The drawing room said, "We have inherited refinement." The library said, "We own books. Whether or not we read them is irrelevant." The dining room said, "If this table doesn't impress you, nothing will." And the upstairs bedrooms, they said, "Don't get too comfortable. This house isn't really for relaxing." Rooms existed for everything except practical living. There were morning rooms, withdrawing rooms, music rooms, billiard rooms, smoking rooms, breakfast rooms, day nurseries, night nurseries, and, just in case boredom tried to sneak in through the back door, conservatories full of plants kept indoors for no other reason than to look mysterious and expensive. If you didn't have multiple rooms, you barely understood. Were you even wealthy? The truth is, wealthy Victorians rarely used most of their rooms. They were too busy walking guests through them and explaining their purpose. Many parts of the house functioned like a museum in which you were both the curator and the endangered exhibit. You didn't live in your house, you supervised it. Your house was technically yours, but only in the same way a royal crown is yours. You're allowed to wear it. but you're also required to maintain it, present it, and pretend it doesn't give you a headache. And the furniture, oh, the furniture. Comfort was never the point. A sofa didn't support your back, it supported your reputation. Chairs were designed less for sitting and more for being admired from 3 feet away. Guests didn't dare sink into them. They perched politely, terrified of damaging upholstery that cost as much as a worker's annual wages. The wealthiest homes often featured furniture so elaborately carved, gilded, embroidered, or tassel-covered that no one actually wanted to touch it. It was furniture meant to be feared. Lighting added another layer of theatricality. Gas lamps illuminated rooms in warm, flickering light that made everything appear dramatic, including your unpaid emotional exhaustion. Chandeliers glittered with crystals that had to be cleaned regularly, usually by someone suspended at a height no Victorian insurance company would approve. Even the glow of the lamps had social meaning. A dimly lit room was atmospheric. A brightly lit room was opulent. A room with lights on during the daytime was a financial flex so powerful it practically yelled, "We fear neither bills nor consequences." And while you were busy hosting the world in your architectural masterpiece, the house was watching you back. Floors creaked at inconvenient moments. Drafts appeared mysteriously, no matter how many servants chased them. Doors refused to close properly in winter, as if protesting the endless work of being impressive. The house was a living, breathing creature that demanded constant care, constant money, and constant apologies on its behalf. The upkeep costs alone could have funded a small village. Roof repairs were inevitable. Chimneys needed cleaning. Wallpaper had to be replaced before it dared fade. Carpets required beating, and windows needed polishing until they shone bright enough to warn ships at sea. Every inch of the house was a reminder that while money bought grandeur, grandeur demanded repayment in the form of your sanity. And yet, despite everything, wealthy Victorians believed wholeheartedly in the power of the grand home. They understood that society made judgments before conversations ever began. A mansion was your resume, your credentials, your performance piece, your one chance to say, without speaking, "Yes, I am wealthy, and yes, you may be deeply impressed now." In the end, the Victorian wealthy lived in houses that were never truly homes. They were monuments, carefully maintained, aggressively decorative, and always hungry for attention. You might sleep there, dine there, host there, and dress there. But the house never let you forget the truth. You didn't own it. You merely managed its expectations. If you were wealthy in Victorian society, the one thing you could never truly purchase, no matter how many zeros decorated your bank account, was solitude. Privacy was theoretically yours. After all, you owned a house large enough to misplace an adult human for several hours. But actual alone time, that was a fantasy, a rumour, a mythical creature whispered about by poets. Because wherever you went, whatever you did, however quietly you tried to exist, a servant was already standing behind you with the silent efficiency of a ghost trained for customer service. Servants filled your world like decorative wallpaper, essential for maintaining the aesthetic, ever-present and impossible to ignore once you noticed them. They moved through the house in carefully orchestrated patterns, like dancers in a very polite, very quiet ballet. A wealthy Victorian didn't live in a home. They lived in a human ecosystem that breathed, worked, whispered, polished, arranged, dusted, prepared, and anticipated. Yes, anticipated. A truly skilled servant knew what you needed before you realized you needed it. A cup of tea appeared when you sighed. Your cloak materialized when you glanced toward the door. Even your newspaper seemed to drift into your hands before your fingers had committed to reaching for it. But the cost of this seamless comfort was your sense of personal space. The idea of being alone with your thoughts simply didn't exist in the upper-class Victorian vocabulary. Your thoughts were accompanied by footsteps, aprons, and a person quietly adjusting a vase behind you. The very structure of wealthy domestic life relied on constant human presence. Staircases echoed with movement. Corridors carried the sounds of preparations. Doors opened before you touched them because someone else had already judged that you were about to approach. Even the silence wasn't truly silent. It had the faint hum of work happening somewhere just out of sight. Take morning routines, for example. You didn't wake up alone. A maid entered your room early, moving with professional stealth, opening curtains with a level of brightness calibrated to your social standing. A footman delivered hot water. Someone else retrieved your clothes. Privacy in the modern sense, rolling out of bed looking like a collapsed puppet, was unimaginable. You awoke knowing that at least 3 people had already participated in your morning before you were fully conscious. Anything you muttered sleepily might be overheard, repeated or politely ignored with the kind of silence that somehow feels louder than a conversation. And the expectations of propriety meant you couldn't even ask to be left alone without raising eyebrows. Wanting solitude suggested emotional weakness, moral instability, or, worst of all, an independent streak. If a wealthy Victorian desired privacy, they had to disguise it as an errand or a sudden urge to inspect the far garden path. You technically owned the house, but requesting a room to yourself felt like asking the staff for temporary custody of your own life. Even when servants weren't physically present, they were near enough for you to sense them, the way one might sense the presence of wildlife in a forest. Their duties required them to remain close, listening for bells, footsteps, or the subtle shift of your mood. A single expression of inconvenience could activate an entire chain reaction. A maid correcting the pillow positioning, a footman adjusting a chair leg, a butler re-evaluating the household's concept of comfort. Wealth insulated you from labour, but not from oversight. Your smallest whim triggered an entire workflow, and that meant someone was always watching, always waiting, always within reach. This ever-present domestic network shaped how the wealthy behaved inside their own homes. People spoke softly, even when no one was in sight. Because someone was always in earshot, they dressed more, carefully even in private rooms because a servant could enter at any time. They limited displays of emotion, because emotional outbursts required explanations, and explanations were exhausting. The house may have been full of luxury, but luxury demanded performance, and performance thrives on an audience, even an unintended one. Letters weren't private unless you physically hid them. Conversations had to be whispered if they involved anything remotely sensitive. Inheritances, scandals, health issues, matchmaking prospects, or Uncle Lionel's gambling problem. Doors were thin, hallways carried echoes, and servants had an unfortunate habit of being in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. This created an environment where secrets were not impossible, they were simply collaborative. At any given moment, at least 6 people knew something they should not know, and all of them were trained to pretend they didn't know it. And then there was the bell system, the bell. Victorian solution to controlling the movement of servants, which ironically did the opposite. Every room had a bell. Every bell summoned a person. Every person monitored for bells. You might think this allowed you to call for help only when needed, but in reality it ensured no servant could move too far away from you at any moment. The bells made solitude logistically impossible. Even the walls were conspiring against you. In the end, wealthy Victorians lived in an environment that blended comfort with constant company. Solitude was a luxury the poor enjoyed by default. Cottages were small, families were busy, and privacy came from necessity. But the wealthy, they traded peace and quiet for polished floors and perfectly arranged mantelpieces. Their houses ran like finely tuned machines, but machines require operators, and operators require proximity. You had privacy, yes, you just never had alone time. In a wealthy Victorian household, servants weren't simply helpers, they were the entire operating system. If your house was a grand machine, the servants were the gears, levers, pulleys, and emergency backup mechanisms that kept the whole thing from collapsing under the weight of its own expectations. The scale alone was astonishing. A truly affluent family didn't employ a maid or 2. They employed a small, specialised workforce with more hierarchy than some municipal governments. You didn't hire help, you managed a population. The butler stood at the top of the domestic hierarchy, which is impressive considering he wasn't the one who owned the house. He was the gatekeeper, the accountant of alcohol, the guardian of silverware, the keeper of the keys, and the man responsible for ensuring that no one, absolutely no one, embarrassed the household by knocking over a wine glass or placing the wrong fork in the wrong location. His presence alone conveyed authority. A butler didn't walk into a room, he materialised with the energy of a well-tailored thundercloud. Below the butler, but still leagues above most of the staff, was the housekeeper. She didn't clean the house herself, just as a general doesn't personally charge into battle. She commanded the troops. Her expertise wasn't in sweeping or polishing, it was in orchestration. She managed schedules, discipline, supplies, linen storage, budget distribution, and any potential household crisis, including, but not limited to, fires, broken furniture, malfunctioning gas lights, suspicious stains, surprise visitors, and the emotional instability of the lady of the house. If the butler ran the house like a fortress, the housekeeper ran it like a kingdom. Then there were the maids, chambermaids, parlour maids, laundry maids, upstairs maids, downstairs maids, and occasionally an in-between maid who existed solely to do the tasks no one wanted to assign definitively to either floor. Their duties were carefully divided because knowledge itself was a kind of power. The maid who handled the bedrooms was not the same maid who handled the public rooms. Heaven forbid someone who dusted the drawing room also touched the mattress. That would blur the social order, and Victorians feared blurred lines more than they feared disease. The cook was a force of nature, more intimidating than the lady of the house, more temperamental than the boilers, and more essential than the wallpaper. The cook ruled the kitchen with absolute authority. She decided menus, controlled supplies, negotiated with vendors, and created meals that impressed guests into believing your family was sophisticated enough to understand French sauces. A household could survive without affection, leisure, or peace, but it couldn't survive without the cook. If she left, the family suffered immediate consequences: culinary, social, emotional, and possibly spiritual. And below her was a staff of kitchen maids and scullery maids, whose daily work was so physically exhausting that modern fitness trainers would classify it as extreme sport. Pots weighing more than toddlers had to be scrubbed, vegetables for 20 could not chop themselves, and mountains of dishes materialised after even the most modest meal. The scullery maid, lowest in the hierarchy, rose before everyone else and collapsed long after the rest of the staff slept. If Victorian households were small governments, the scullery maid was the civil servant doing all the work while the rest of the system took credit. Footmen, meanwhile, existed primarily to look beautiful. They wore livery so elegant it bordered on decorative art, and were chosen for height, posture, and general shininess. Their actual tasks, including serving meals, opening doors, carrying items, and announcing guests, were secondary to their real purpose, showcasing the family's wealth by existing. The richer the family, the more footmen they had. 2 footmen meant respectability. 4 footmen meant status. 6 footmen meant you were showing off. 8 footmen meant you were deliberately taunting your neighbours. Then we have the nanny and nursery staff who operated in an entirely separate world. Children were hidden upstairs, accessible only by designated servants who ensured they were fed, washed, dressed, disciplined, and trained to behave like junior members of a respectable dynasty. Parents visited periodically, as if checking on a long-term investment. But the true evidence that servants formed the infrastructure of the household was the sheer coordination required to keep everything functioning. Each day ran on a schedule so precise it made military timetables look careless. Bells rang, tasks rotated, floors were swept, carpets beaten, silver polished, fires lit, candles trimmed, coal carried, water fetched, clothes brushed, boots shined, and meals prepared. Not only did this require dozens of people, it required dozens of roles that could not be swapped without social disaster. If any single servant failed in their duty, even slightly, the entire machine faltered. A footman stumbling during dinner could ruin the family's reputation. A maid leaving a smudge on a mirror could convince visiting relatives that the house was descending into moral decay. A cook refusing to prepare a dish could spark a domestic crisis requiring diplomatic intervention. The servants kept the house and the family's image in perfect working order. Their labour was invisible because it had to be. If a guest noticed the servants, that meant the system was failing. In short, wealthy Victorian households did not operate like homes. They operated like institutions, structured, hierarchical, deeply interdependent. The staff wasn't there to make your life easier. They were there to uphold a standard so demanding that no ordinary family could achieve it without an entire workforce. You didn't employ people, you managed a population. In wealthy Victorian society, cleanliness was never just about hygiene. It was about morality, respectability, social identity, and the subtle but powerful art of proving that you were, in fact, the kind of person who deserved to be wealthy. Dirt was not simply dirt. It was evidence. Evidence that you were lazy, unrefined, possibly unstable, and almost certainly hiding a moral failing somewhere between your conscience and your carpets. Being dusty wasn't messy. It was suspicious. This obsession with cleanliness came from a unique blend of religious morality, scientific confusion, and social anxiety. The Victorians were deeply concerned with outward appearances. After all, if your house looked spotless and your clothes appeared immaculate, then surely everything inside your soul was equally polished. Cleanliness signalled self-discipline. Cleanliness signalled order. Cleanliness signalled that you were not, heaven forbid, backsliding toward the social chaos of the lower classes. Because if dirt crept into your life, who knew what else might follow? Disorder? Immorality? A decline in social status? A cousin marrying poorly? A scandal involving handprints on a banister? The wealthy took this concept seriously, so seriously that the state of one's home functioned like a personality test. A gleaming staircase meant moral fibre. Dust-free shelves meant inner strength. A polished doorknob meant spiritual clarity. And if your visitors spotted smudges on the window glass, well, you might as well confess your sins on the spot. The battle for cleanliness began the moment you woke. Your hair had to be brushed, your face washed, your clothes spotless, your shoes buffed, and your entire appearance calibrated to suggest that dust had never dared approach you in your life. Running water wasn't always available, yes, even for the rich. But that didn't matter. A wealthy Victorian could afford the labour required to haul hot water upstairs. What mattered wasn't the ease of cleaning, it was the result. For women, the pressure was even greater. A lady's virtue was often judged by the shine of her home. The parlour had to look untouched by mortal hands. The drapes had to hang in perfect order. Every surface needed to be free of hairpins, crumbs, or evidence that humans existed in the room. Even flowers had to be arranged so artfully that guests believed you'd spent the morning negotiating with nature itself. A lady who maintained a spotless home wasn't simply tidy. She was respectable. She possessed good character, a phrase that Victorians used with the same intensity modern people reserve for credit score. And the wealthy didn't rely solely on servants to achieve this immaculate world. They relied on systems. There were strict cleaning schedules for every room in the house. Silver polishing happened on specific days. Rugs were beaten at specific intervals. Velvet had to be brushed in specific directions. Brass fixtures were polished until they reflected faces with frightening clarity. Even the coal, scuttles, literal containers for soot, were expected to look like showroom pieces. If you visited someone's home and saw a streak of soot or a carpet slightly askew, you immediately formed an opinion about the family's character. Maybe the lady of the house had lost control. Maybe the servants were rebelling. Maybe, gasp, the family was in financial trouble. too poor to hire enough hands to wage their never-ending war against dust. Cleanliness was social currency, and the wealthy guarded it with the paranoia usually reserved for political conspiracies. But the irony was rich. While the wealthy polished everything in sight, Victorian cities themselves were catastrophically filthy. Coal smoke choked the air. Horses left their contributions everywhere. Factories spewed grime. Streets flooded with mud, sewage, and mysterious substances that probably deserved scientific classification. But none of that mattered. Inside your home you maintained an alternate universe, one in which filth did not exist because you had scrubbed any trace of it into submission. Visitors arriving at your home went through a silent inspection ritual the moment they stepped through the door. The entrance hall had to strike them speechless with purity. If they caught even the faintest whiff of dust, they might conclude that you had slipped morally, financially, or intellectually. Cleanliness wasn't a preference, it was a declaration, and personal cleanliness followed the same logic. Bathing varied, some wealthy families bathed weekly, some more often, but maintaining the appearance of freshness was non-negotiable. Victorians used powders, perfumes, soaps, hair tonics, breath fresheners, and fabrics designed to mask odours that modern noses would not classify as fresh. Cleanliness was a performance, but it was a convincing one. If you smelled pleasant and looked polished, then clearly you were a virtuous and well-regulated human being. This moralised. Cleanliness even shaped how people behaved. You moved carefully to avoid disturbing settled dust. You handled objects gently so as not to leave fingerprints. You refrained from touching walls or leaning on tables. Touching anything too casually implied familiarity with the physical world, which the wealthy preferred to pretend they transcended. In the end, wealthy Victorians lived in polished environments not because they were germ-free, they didn't fully understand germs yet, but because cleanliness signalled control. Control over the home, control over the staff, control over one's emotions, habits, desires, impulses, and reputation. A spotless house didn't just say, "We clean." It said, "We are who society expects us to be." And in Victorian society, being dusty wasn't simply messy, it was suspicious. For the wealthy Victorian, dinner was not a meal. It was a performance review with cutlery. The table wasn't set for eating, it was set for judgment. Every plate, every spoon, every napkin fold announced to your guests, "We have trained for this." And when you finally took your seat, you weren't preparing to satisfy your appetite. You were preparing to demonstrate that you had been raised correctly. In Victorian society, hunger was irrelevant. Breeding was everything. Food didn't feed you, it evaluated you. A formal Victorian dinner could last anywhere from 2 hours to the length of a modern miniseries. And unlike today, where dinner parties aim for fun, comfort, or at least edible food, Victorian dinners aimed for precision. The wealthy treated dining like an Olympic event, highly coordinated, brutally scrutinised, and faintly exhausting. Before you even lifted a fork, the table sent a message. The arrangement had to be perfect, not pleasing, not symmetrical, but perfect according to Victorian rules so detailed they bordered on theological. Centerpieces were tall, but not so tall that guests couldn't see each other. Candles provided, just enough light to flatter faces but not enough to reveal fine wrinkles, emotional fatigue, or underlying marital resentment. Table linens had to be white, absolute white, because the colour symbolised purity, refinement, and the household's ability to terrorise laundry maids into achieving impossible stain removal. Then came the cutlery, multiple forks, spoons, knives, and utensils that the average person would require a manual to operate. There was a fork for fish, another for entrees, and one specifically for manoeuvring asparagus. If you used the wrong fork, you didn't just commit a mistake, you committed a social autobiography. A single error revealed everything: your upbringing, your education, your mother's competence, your father's moral character, and possibly the long-term stability of your entire family line. And the courses, oh, the courses. Victorian meals were built like architectural structures, layered, elaborate, and occasionally unstable. A typical dinner included soup, fish, a remove, roast meats, game birds, jellied dishes of ambiguous intention, puddings both steamed and morally questionable, pastries, fruit, and cheese. You were not expected to eat everything. You were expected to appear competent near everything. Your appetite meant nothing. Whether you'd skipped lunch didn't matter. Whether you were starving didn't matter. Whether you were still full from last night's 12 courses didn't matter. Eating was secondary to demonstrating the correct posture, the correct timing, and the correct expression of enthusiastic yet restrained enjoyment. If you smiled too much, you looked childish. If you didn't smile enough, you looked aloof. If you grimaced at a strange dish, you revealed a lack of refinement. And if you dared to show genuine hunger, well, you might as well have walked in barefoot. Conversation during dinner followed strict rules. You spoke only to the person on your left for certain courses and only to the person on your right for others. You never raised your voice. You never brought up money. You never mentioned illness. And you never expressed an opinion too passionately, because passion was undignified and could lead to enthusiasm, which was practically indecent. Conversation was meant to glide, graceful, effortless, and entirely free of any topic that might reveal your personality. The meal was choreographed down to the second. Footmen glided around the table, replacing plates, filling glasses, serving dishes, and observing your every facial twitch to anticipate your needs before you voiced them. The best service was invisible. If you noticed a servant, it meant the timing was off. If a plate scraped, the rhythm was broken. If a glass clinked, the atmosphere cracked. A Victorian dinner wasn't simply hosted, it was conducted. And the expectations for the lady of the house were even more demanding. She wasn't just a hostess, she was the spiritual centre of the meal. Her ability to control the tone, timing, and emotional climate of the dinner was considered a reflection of her entire worth as a woman. A successful dinner meant she was a capable wife, mother, and administrator. A failed dinner meant she needed to reflect on her failings, preferably somewhere out of sight, perhaps while crying into the lace tablecloth she'd spent hours selecting. The gentleman of the house had his own responsibilities, carving meat without sweating, telling restrained stories, pouring wine with grace, and maintaining an air of dignified authority even when he secretly wished the meal had ended an hour ago. He also had to avoid committing the greatest dining sin of all, looking bored. Boredom suggested ingratitude, and ingratitude suggested decline. Dessert offered no relief. Victorian desserts were complicated affairs involving moulded shapes, elaborate sugar sculptures, and fruit arranged so artistically it felt rude to eat it. Even dessert forks had rules. Even the act of accepting a piece of cake had implications about your character. And when the meal finally ended, the examination continued. The ladies withdrew to another room to discuss socially approved topics, while the men lingered over port and cigars to perform their own rituals of respectability. The dinner might be over, but its consequences lingered like the aftertaste of an overly perfumed pudding. Guests would remember who behaved well, who slipped, who sparkled, who faltered, who passed the test, and who failed it with tragic enthusiasm. That was the heart of wealthy Victorian dining. The food existed, but not for nourishment. It existed to reveal who you were, or at least who you had been trained to pretend to be. Dinner didn't fill your stomach, it filled your reputation. In Victorian society, you didn't eat a meal, you survived an evaluation. For wealthy Victorians, dinner wasn't just a meal. It was an endurance event performed in slow motion. The more time it consumed, the more successful it was considered. A fast dinner was a catastrophe, a social emergency, a sign that somewhere in the chain of service, etiquette, or emotional poise, someone had failed. Because in the Victorian upper class, speed meant scarcity, leisure meant abundance, and stretching a meal across hours wasn't an inconvenience, It was a declaration of rank. If dinner was fast, something had gone terribly wrong. The logic behind this glacial pace was simple. The wealthy wanted to demonstrate that they had nothing urgent to do. Only the poor rushed. Only people with jobs hurried. Only the socially endangered ate quickly, as though life might demand something else of them. But the upper classes, they luxuriated in time like it was a silk garment draped over the evening, and nothing advertised that luxury better than a dinner too long to justify, but too impressive to question. A multi-course Victorian dinner began with anticipation, polite anticipation of course, performed with straight posture and the mild expression of someone who has trained their face to appear pleasantly interested for indefinite durations. The first course arrived with ceremony. Then, once it was eaten, it disappeared, and guests waited, quietly, gracefully, and for longer than any modern diner would tolerate, until the next course appeared. The pauses weren't mistakes, they were strategy. Each interval reminded everyone present that there was no rush, no pressure, no schedule. You had the privilege of waiting. Footmen and maids moved with deliberate slowness because haste was vulgar. Dishes were cleared silently, one at a time, in a rhythm intended to soothe and impress. The next course wasn't brought until the entire table was ready. An agreement reached telepathically through a combination of social cues, micro-gestures, and the butler's uncanny ability to perceive hunger without acknowledging it. No Victorian diner dared look impatient. Impatience suggested a lack of refinement. Hunger, too, was something to conceal. Only animals ate urgently. Humans, especially wealthy ones, ate as if food were a philosophical concept rather than a biological requirement. The structure of the meal contributed to its length. Victorian dining followed a progression so elaborate it made opera schedules look concise. After soup came fish. After fish came a remove. After the remove came roasts, then entrees, then game, then salads, then jellies, then pastries, then puddings, then fruit, then cheese. And at each step diners had to assess the dish, comment politely on it, pretend to eat only a modest amount, and maintain the illusion that they would somehow survive the remainder of the evening. Dining slowly also allowed guests to perform their social roles. A Victorian dinner was a conversation marathon, punctuated by the arrival of increasingly decorative dishes. Every pause between courses was a chance to refine your reputation. Speak too much, and you seemed overeager. Speak too little, and you seemed dull. Speak passionately, and you risked emotional indecency. Speak incorrectly, and your blunder circulated through drawing rooms for months. The safest approach was gentle conversation, timed to the rhythm of the service, measured like music played in a minor key. Even the food itself contributed to the pace. Victorian dishes were elaborate, and eating them required strategy. Bones had to be navigated. Sauces had to be handled with precision. Jellies wobbled in ways that made cutting them without appearing chaotic a genuine skill. And some dishes, especially towering moulded creations, were so structurally ambitious that guests spent several minutes simply trying to determine where, exactly, to place their fork without triggering a collapse. Servants reappeared between courses not just to clear plates but to re-coordinate the battlefield. Wine glasses were refilled in quiet, seamless rotations. Tablecloth crumbs were swept with tiny brushes designed specifically for that purpose. Napkins were discreetly replaced if they showed the faintest sign of usage. Everything happened slowly because everything had to happen perfectly. And when conversation flagged, as it inevitably did around course 9, guests leaned into the lull with serene acceptance. A lull wasn't awkward. A lull was aristocratic. Silence proved you were comfortable with time, comfortable with stillness, comfortable with the knowledge that dessert remained at least 40 minutes away. Finally, when dessert appeared, often in dazzling architectural forms involving sugar sculptures, candied fruits, and puddings that resembled edible sculptures, the pace did not accelerate. Dessert was meant to be admired before it was consumed. Hours into the meal, no one was hungry, but hunger was irrelevant. The purpose of dessert was not nourishment. It was climax. By the time dinner concluded, guests felt a peculiar blend of exhaustion and accomplishment. They had survived 12 or more courses without spilling, rushing, making an error, or revealing a genuine human appetite. The entire evening had been a marathon of poise, a slow procession of dishes timed to the rhythms of wealth. This was the Victorian message. Only the desperate ate quickly. Only the unrefined ate practically. The truly wealthy stretched time like ribbon, soft, decorative, and entirely useless, except for its ability to impress. Dinner didn't take hours because it needed to. Dinner took hours because the wealthy wanted to prove they had hours to spare. To be wealthy in Victorian society was to engage daily in a ritual of beautifully coordinated discomfort. Clothing was not chosen for practicality, mobility, warmth, or, heaven forbid, comfort. Clothing was chosen to announce something: refinement, status, breeding, self-control, aesthetic suffering, and the kind of disciplined posture normally achieved only through military training or divine intervention. You didn't just wear fashion, you endured it. You looked expensive because you suffered correctly. Victorian fashion functioned as a silent language spoken fluently by the upper classes. Every detail, every ruffle, button, stitch, hemline, and fastener held meaning. Clothing was a form of social code, one that allowed the wealthy to identify each other instantly, while silently informing everyone beneath them how impossibly expensive it was to maintain such appearances. The more complicated the clothing, the higher the status. Simplicity was suspicious. Comfort was catastrophic. For women, the day began not with choosing an outfit, but choosing which outfit was appropriate for the time of day, the occasion, the season, the company, the lighting, the expected weather, the emotional tone of the afternoon, and the delicate rules of social convention that governed everything from sleeve length to embroidery density. There were morning dresses, visiting dresses, afternoon dresses, walking dresses, dinner dresses, ball gowns, riding habits, and tea gowns. And those categories weren't poetic. They were mandatory. Wearing an afternoon dress at the wrong hour of the morning was as socially suicidal as confessing you preferred convenience over tradition. Underneath these gowns lurked engineering. Corsets shaped the torso into a fashionable silhouette at the cost of oxygen and mobility. A perfectly laced corset didn't just compress your waist, it compressed your ambition to bend at the torso in any meaningful way. Breathing became an act of restraint. Sitting required planning. Dropping something on the floor was an emergency, because retrieving it involved geometric calculations, emotional preparation, and occasionally the assistance of another human. But a tightly laced corset signalled discipline, elegance, and the admirable ability to function while partially folded in half. Then there were the skirts, hooped skirts, crinolines, bustles, each designed to create a fashionable shape and also to transform daily life into a sequence of obstacles. A wealthy Victorian woman could not enter narrow doorways without sideways negotiation. She could not sit without arranging her skirts into an architectural structure. She could not turn quickly without risking knocking over furniture, small children, or poorly placed decorative vases. Yet the more impractical the skirt, the greater the social triumph. A skirt that restricted movement meant you didn't need to move often, a luxury only the wealthy could afford. For men, the suffering was equally intentional, though less flamboyant. A Victorian gentleman was expected to maintain impeccable tailoring at all times, waistcoats that hug the torso, collars stiff enough to serve as architectural supports, and coats cut to restrict slouching with ruthless efficiency. Even leisure clothing demanded elegance. There was no outfit designed for comfort, only varying degrees of formality. Gentleman's walking coat could withstand a mild windstorm. His shirt collar could withstand a philosophical argument. His shoes were polished to such a shine that stepping outdoors felt like an act of betrayal. But the real pressure came from the relentless pursuit of perfection. Clothing had to be immaculate. No wrinkles, no loose threads, no stains, no signs of having been worn by a human with bodily needs or a schedule. Laundry practices of the time were punishing on fabrics, but no Victorian aristocrat cared. If a garment weakened under the strain of constant washing, it was replaced. Clothing wasn't meant to last. Clothing was meant to perform. Accessories added another layer of complexity. Gloves were essential, indoors, outdoors, in carriages, at dinners, during visits, at balls. A lady's gloves indicated her status, the recentness of her purchases, and her ability to avoid touching anything that might stain them. Fans served as tools of communication, flirtation, and air circulation, though mostly the first two. Parasols shielded delicate complexions from sunlight, which had the audacity to darken skin, and therefore threatened to associate the wealthy with labourers who actually worked outdoors. For men, accessories revolved around hats, canes, pocket watches, and the silent competition to display an effortless mastery of them. A gentleman's cane wasn't for walking, it was for existing stylishly. His hat wasn't for warmth, it was for tipping with precision. His watch wasn't for timekeeping, it was for reminding others that he had appointments, even if he had no intention of keeping them. And fashion was not purely individual, it was competitive. Trends shifted quickly, and those who failed to keep up risked signalling decline. You weren't simply dressing for yourself, you were dressing to prove that your family was thriving. Guests observed hems, fabrics, stitching and jewellery with the same intensity modern people reserve for stock prices. A gown made from last season's silk screamed disaster. A gentleman wearing a coat cut 2 years behind the fashion cycle might as well have declared bankruptcy. But through all of this, one truth defined wealthy Victorian fashion. Discomfort proved refinement. Anyone could wear something comfortable. Only the wealthy could wear something so inconvenient, so restrictive, so physically demanding that it required an entire support system. Dressers, tailors, personal maids, boot polishers, laundresses, and the occasional spouse offering moral support. Elegance was achieved through endurance. Style was achieved through suffering, and the wealthy endured beautifully. In Victorian society, looking refined meant sacrificing ease, looking fashionable meant sacrificing freedom, and looking expensive meant suffering correctly. To be wealthy in Victorian society was to treat your body less like a living organism and more like a public sculpture, an object meant to be admired, not used. Every movement, gesture, and breath was governed by rules so strict they made military posture look relaxed. Elegance wasn't natural, it was engineered. Respectability was not expressed through words, it was carved into your body through endless practice, physical discipline, and, when necessary, mild suffocation. Breathing was optional, posture was mandatory. Victorian society believed, with absolute sincerity, that moral character was visible. A slouched back suggested an undisciplined mind. A relaxed stance hinted at laziness. A careless gait implied moral instability. If your shoulders drooped, people assumed your principles drooped with them. Your spine wasn't just a spine, it was a resume of your upbringing. For women, achieving elegance began with corsetry, an instrument of both beauty and gentle torment. A corset didn't simply shape the waist, it altered the entire body's behaviour. Once laced in, you stood straighter than human physiology naturally encourages, your shoulders gently pushed back, your rib cage compressed, and your breathing demoted to short, polite sips of air. The fashionable waistline was narrow not because women magically possessed it, but because corsets forced the torso into a silhouette that announced refinement while quietly discouraging bending, twisting, or sudden emotional reactions. Movement became choreography. Sitting required lowering oneself gracefully, as though joints were optional and time had slowed. Rising involved pressing gloved fingers lightly against a chair. a gesture intended to appear delicate and absolutely not reliant on the upper body strength that corsets inconveniently restricted. Walking required gliding, not stepping, as if your feet barely touched the ground. Women learned to move in straight lines, turn slowly, and avoid any motion that suggested haste. Haste was inappropriate and worse, unfashionable. The neck, too, was trained. The wealthy were instructed to hold their heads as though balancing an invisible crown, the chin level, the eye steady, the overall expression one of mild, unbothered superiority. Even facial muscles were disciplined. No grimacing, no wide-mouthed laughter, no exaggerated expressions. Emotion was allowed, but only in the same way spices are allowed in delicate cooking, barely detectable to anyone but experts. Men, though spared the corset most of the time, faced their own physical expectations. A Victorian gentleman's posture was a performance of control. Chest expanded, shoulders back, chin lifted at an angle that communicated confidence without arrogance, authority without aggression. Slouching was unthinkable. Leaning was dangerous. Lounging was a sign of moral decay. Even sitting had rules. Knees together, hands positioned properly, and no sprawling whatsoever. A wealthy man could be forgiven many things: bad jokes, poor dancing, errant opinions, but he could not be forgiven a collapsed posture. Stiff collars reinforced this: discipline. These collars could cut into the neck, restrict movement, and force the wearer to turn his head using his entire torso like a dignified but mildly frustrated statue. Tight waistcoats encouraged shallow breathing. Tailcoats narrowed the range of acceptable gestures. Every garment worked in partnership with etiquette to produce a man who moved with precision, elegance, and, ideally, no visible signs of discomfort. But posture was only one aspect of bodily discipline. Restraint was the larger philosophy. A wealthy Victorian learned to regulate every physical impulse, laughing softly, speaking gently, eating neatly, standing calmly, and never reacting too strongly to anything. Not joy, not shock, not emotional distress, and certainly not physical discomfort. If your shoes pinched or your stays dug into your ribs, you endured in silence. If you felt faint, which was common thanks to restrictive clothing, you simply rested gracefully while someone opened a window nearby. Even coughing had rules. An acceptable cough was discreet, delicate, and ideally non-existent. Blowing one's nose had to be accomplished with such subtlety that observers questioned whether it had happened at all. Any bodily noise, stomach growling, throat clearing, joints cracking, was a personal betrayal, the kind of thing you apologize for internally while maintaining an outward expression of serenity. Training began in childhood. Wealthy children were taught posture through exercises, balance books, supervised walking practice, and gentle corrections that ensured they entered adulthood capable of sitting upright for hours without support. Posture was a lifelong discipline, not a style. The poor worked with their bodies, the wealthy controlled theirs. That was the ideology, and the social consequences of poor posture were real. A woman whose shoulders slumped was pitied as weak-willed. A man who walked with looseness was whispered about as lacking refinement. Even fatigue was considered a small moral failure, as though tired muscles suggested tired values. In extreme cases, a young woman's chances of marriage could be influenced by something as simple as the angle of her chin. In this world, the body was a statement. It wasn't allowed to express fatigue, hunger, excitement, or stress. It existed to demonstrate training, discipline, and restraint. If elegance was visible, it meant you had successfully conquered your impulses. If discomfort was invisible, it meant you belonged. Victorian wealth wasn't just displayed through clothes, houses, or carriages. It was displayed through the quiet rigidity of the spine, the stillness of the hands, the measured breath of someone carefully rationing oxygen for aesthetic reasons. In this society, control equaled respectability, and while breathing was optional, posture was mandatory. For wealthy Victorians, leisure was not the absence of responsibility, it was a responsibility. Pleasure couldn't, simply be enjoyed. It had to be curated, moderated, monitored, and performed with the precision of a well-rehearsed ceremony. You didn't relax freely, you relaxed correctly. Fun was permitted, yes, but only in forms that reinforced your refinement, your self-control, and your awareness that at any moment someone might be quietly evaluating your character from across the garden. You relaxed, but only in socially acceptable ways. The Victorian upper class believed leisure was a moral indicator. The activities you chose revealed your upbringing, your social priorities, and your understanding of your place in the world. Activities that looked frivolous were frowned upon. Activities that looked purposeful, even if they were no more useful than watching grass grow, were applauded. Leisure, like everything else in upper-class life, had to signal that you were cultured, refined, and gently insulated from the messy realities of life. Take the classic pastime, reading. Reading wasn't simply entertainment. It was self-improvement disguised as relaxation. A wealthy person didn't curl up with a scandalous novel. They selected a volume of poetry, classical essays, travel accounts, or ideally something in French. Fiction was acceptable only if it had been approved by critics and featured moral lessons, inspiring deaths, or characters who learned, slowly and painfully, to be more respectable. Reading too quickly looked unrefined. Reading too passionately looked emotional. The ideal Victorian reader maintained a calm, statuesque expression, nodding delicately at well-written sentences while pretending not to notice when a particularly dense passage threatened to lull them into a nap. Walking, another popular leisure activity, came with rules. A walk could not be too fast, vulgar, too slow, suggestive of laziness, too long, suggestive of restlessness, or too short, suggestive of disinterest in nature. Women walked with parasols, gloves, and layers of fabric that transformed the simple act of movement into a gentle, managed glide. Men walked with canes, hats, and a sense of purpose that hinted at contemplation but not urgency. Strolling through parks was an art. One had to appear relaxed but not inattentive, thoughtful but not melancholy, pleasantly sociable but not prone to idle chatter. Even your footsteps had a personality. For indoor leisure, card games and parlour games were carefully controlled affairs. Gambling for high stakes was frowned upon in respectable circles, but games requiring memorization or attention to detail were celebrated. They demonstrated mental discipline, something the wealthy valued almost as much as upholstery that never wrinkled. Charades was popular, but not the silly, exuberant version known today. Victorian charades were elaborate, restrained, and intellectual. Everyone enjoyed participating, provided no one appeared too excited. Enthusiasm was always suspicious. Music was another essential leisure skill. Oh, refined Victorian lady was expected to play piano or sing, not with talent necessarily, but with correctness. The point was not to be brilliant. The point was to be decorous. A lady performing too passionately risked displaying emotion, which was dangerous. A gentleman, on the other hand, usually avoided performing entirely unless he was unusually skilled or unusually brave. His job was to listen with dignified appreciation, applauding softly and offering compliments that sounded formal enough to be recited at a board meeting. Collecting was a particularly fashionable pastime. Seashells, pressed flowers, ancient coins, porcelain figurines, or rare books all signalled intellectual curiosity, even if the collector couldn't explain the difference between Roman and Greek pottery without consulting a servant. Displays were curated in drawing rooms where guests could admire them and silently judge their worth. The true purpose of collecting was not pleasure, it was conversation, ammunition. Then there were social visits, considered leisure, though they functioned more like performance art. Calling on acquaintances required strict timing. Arrive too early and you appeared overeager. Arrive too late and you risked interrupting dinner preparations. Conversations were polite, brief, and meaningless by design. You complimented the drapes, the weather, the newest portrait of the host's second cousin, and then departed gracefully. The entire interaction lasted less than 15 minutes. but it counted as leisure because you weren't technically working. Instead, you were maintaining social bonds with the efficiency of a very polite postal service. Even hobbies like gardening required supervision. Wealthy Victorians did not kneel in the dirt. Such behaviour was reserved for professionals with actual skills. Instead, they directed gardeners, strolling through the estate with a thoughtful expression, offering comments such as perhaps the roses should breathe more, or this hedge longs to be shaped. Gardening was not about plants. It was about cultivating serenity while someone else cultivated everything else. Physical hobbies existed too. Archery for women, horseback riding for both genders, fencing or cricket for men. But these were not athletic experiences. They were demonstrations of control. Riding was elegant, not daring. Archery was graceful, not competitive. Cricket was gentlemanly, not sweaty. The goal was to participate without appearing to exert oneself, a challenge best described as exercise but make it aristocratic. And relaxation always took place in the context of supervision, literal or social. Servants hovered nearby to provide materials, refreshments, or emergency interventions. Other members of your social circle observed your behaviour, judging whether your leisure reflected your rank. Even when alone, a wealthy Victorian monitored their own posture, expression and conduct because unsupervised behaviour hinted at the possibility of personality which was dangerous. In the wealthy Victorian world, leisure was never about pleasure. It was about signalling competence, refinement, and a life structured so tightly that even relaxation required etiquette. You could rest. You just couldn't rest freely. In wealthy Victorian society, children were not simply members of the family. They were long-term investments, delicate projects carefully shaped, polished, supervised, corrected, and strategically positioned for future social success. Every child represented a legacy, a family reputation, a potential heir, and a potential embarrassment. Parents loved their children deeply. They simply chose to express that love by staying far enough away to ensure the children did not inhale any of their unrefined humanity. You loved your children deeply, from a distance. A wealthy Victorian child's day-to-day existence unfolded in a completely separate world from that of their parents, both physically and emotionally. The nursery, located on an upper floor of the house, functioned like a parallel universe with its own routines, rules, hierarchy, and authority figures. Children didn't tumble around drawing rooms or wander into parlours. They lived upstairs, behind doors overseen by a strict chain of command, the nanny, the nursemaid, and occasionally a governess. These women were the architects of childhood. Parents visited in brief ceremonious intervals, much like dignitaries inspecting a foreign territory. The nanny ruled the nursery with an iron spoon. She ensured schedules were followed, clothing was immaculate, manners were drilled, and emotional expression was controlled. The idea was simple. If a child learned discipline young, very young, they would grow into adults capable of sitting through a 12-course dinner without fidgeting, fainting inconveniently, or blurting out unrefined truths. Nannies weren't just caregivers. They were moral engineers. They trained children to behave in ways their parents could proudly display, on specific days, for controlled durations under appropriate lighting. The nursery was a world of structure. Children woke early, washed, often reluctantly, and dressed in stiff garments that prepared them for adulthood by teaching the value of discomfort. Meals happened at fixed times, always supervised. Play, too, was scheduled and organised. There were approved toys, wooden blocks, dolls, miniature tea sets, and unapproved toys, which typically included anything fun. Outdoor activity required gloves, hats, propriety, and constant reminders not to soil one's clothing, because even in childhood, appearances mattered. Parents themselves occupied a surprisingly ceremonial role in their children's lives. A mother might see her children once or twice a day, briefly, calmly, never in a way that allowed the children to mistake her for someone responsible for their immediate happiness. Showing too much affection was discouraged. It risked spoiling the child, or worse, revealing softness. The mother's responsibility was oversight, not intimacy. She ensured the nursery ran smoothly, but rarely stepped inside the day-to-day chaos. Her love existed, but it floated high above the nursery like a decorative chandelier. Visible, essential, and never touched. Fathers were even more distant. Their interactions with children were limited, formal, and often scheduled like diplomatic meetings. A father might read to his child, offer advice, supervise a birthday gift, or present himself during important milestones. But daily involvement, that was the job of professionals. In Victorian society, a father who spent excessive time with his children risked being perceived as overly emotional, overly involved, or insufficiently occupied with adult responsibilities like politics, property, or appearing serious in public. One might imagine that the governess provided emotional warmth, but even she was bound by the rigid expectations of the household. A governess stood in a lonely, borderline awkward social position. Not a servant, not a family member, permanently poised between affection and professional restraint. She taught lessons: reading, writing, arithmetic, French, geography, and moral instruction, with a seriousness that made childhood feel like a prelude to adulthood, rather than an experience to enjoy. Her job was to prepare children for society, not to help them enjoy themselves within it. The wealthy believed children needed shaping, not companionship. Childhood was a period of intense moulding, of morals, habits, manners, posture, vocabulary, and self-control. Running, shouting, or laughing too loudly was discouraged. Curiosity was encouraged only when it reinforced social values. Children rarely saw the bustling life of the household, the formal dinners, the adult conversations, or the elaborate rituals happening downstairs. Their world was sheltered, monitored, sanitized, and curated with almost scientific precision. But the most defining feature of wealthy Victorian childhood was the emotional distance. Love existed, but it moved through intermediaries. Parents demonstrated affection not through hugs, time, or conversation, but through the quality of the governess, the condition of the nursery, and the educational opportunities provided. A child who received a pony was loved. A child who received a stern lecture with a gentle smile was adored. But a child who wanted spontaneous affection quickly learned that affection was something reserved for special occasions, like birthdays or national tragedies. This emotional detachment wasn't cruelty, it was ideology. The wealthy believed that indulgence weakened children. Toughness prepared them for the rigid expectations of adulthood. To thrive in society, a child had to learn composure early, how to hide discomfort, master etiquette, endure boredom, and present a polished exterior even when hungry, tired, or confused. In some ways, wealthy children lived like small ambassadors, trained constantly in the arts of public behaviour. And yet, despite the distance, the bonds were real. Parents cared, deeply, just not in ways modern readers recognise. Their hope was that by creating orderly, supervised childhoods, they were giving their offspring every advantage: social polish, moral clarity, educational superiority, and the ability to navigate a world designed around appearances. In the Victorian elite, children were loved, unquestionably. They were simply loved professionally through staff, schedules, and silence. You loved your children deeply, from a distance. For the wealthy Victorian child, education was not a journey of discovery. It was a polishing process. Learning existed not to expand the mind, but to perfect the performance. Facts mattered, but only the right ones. Skills mattered, but only the ones that impressed. And intellectual curiosity? That was a charming trait for poets, scientists, and other people who worked for a living. For the upper class, knowledge wasn't power. Refinement was. Education began early, often administered by a rotating cast of specialized tutors whose primary mission was to cultivate the appropriate veneer of sophistication. A wealthy family didn't hire a tutor to produce a genius. They hired a tutor to produce a child who could enter a room speak two socially acceptable sentences in French, quote a classical author without mispronouncing Latin, and then sit silently with flawless posture until spoken to again. The goal wasn't brilliance. The goal was polish. Boys and girls both received education, but their paths diverged sharply. For boys, learning emphasized the subjects that would prepare them for the public stage: Latin, Greek, mathematics, geography, scripture, classical history, and the kind of literature that taught moral lessons, preferably involving noble suffering. Tutors drilled recitations, translations, and essays designed to cultivate the appearance of intellectual rigour. Whether the boy actually understood Plato mattered far less than whether he could quote Plato convincingly in front of guests. Girls, meanwhile, had their education shaped by the Victorian expectations of femininity. Their studies took place under the supervision of a governess, or visiting masters who specialised in artistry rather than analysis. Music was essential. A young lady played the piano not because she dreamed of concert halls, but because performing at social gatherings signalled refinement. Drawing, painting, embroidery and watercolours were taught with equal seriousness. These weren't hobbies, they were accomplishments, proof that a young woman had cultivated grace, patience, and that most prized of Victorian virtues, genteel boredom tolerance. Language study played an enormous role in both boys' and girls' education. French was essential, not because the wealthy intended to converse with Parisians, but because fluency implied culture. Italian was acceptable for musical appreciation. German was fashionable among intellectuals, though only the select few ventured into it. A young lady who could sing a German art song was admired. A young man who could read Goethe was considered promising. But the true value of language learning wasn't communication. It was symbolism. Speaking French meant you were civilized. Speaking only English meant you were probably from the provinces. Science existed on the curriculum, but cautiously. Chemistry was acceptable as long as it didn't lead to experiments that produced smells. Botany was perfectly respectable. Identifying plants was an elegant way to pretend one had first-hand knowledge of the outdoors without actually going into the outdoors. Natural philosophy was encouraged, provided it stayed philosophical. Anything involving hands-on investigation looked too much like work. Mathematics, too, was restricted by decorum. For boys, geometry, and algebra signalled discipline. For girls, mathematics was taught gently, in case too much numerical exposure strained their delicate faculties. No Victorian mother wanted her daughter to become too competent with figures. That might lead to independence, and independence was a dangerous educational side effect. But the true heart of elite Victorian education lay in its structure. Rigid schedules, silent study periods, rehearsed recitations, and daily demonstrations of progress. A child wasn't expected to enjoy learning. Enjoyment suggested frivolity. Instead, successful learning produced composure. Mastery of material mattered less than mastery of demeanour. A child could misunderstand a poem entirely as long as they quoted it beautifully. And if a child did show genuine curiosity, the household reacted with polite confusion. Curiosity was unpredictable. It suggested appetite, passion, or nonconformity. 3 qualities wealthy Victorians worked very hard to eliminate. A curious child asked questions, explored ideas, or sought answers independently. All of these behaviours threatened the delicate order of elite education, which depended on control, repetition, and the strategic delivery of knowledge that reinforced social norms. Instead, the ideal student was one who learned just enough to navigate society with ease. A boy needed to discuss parliamentary matters without offering real opinions. A girl needed to entertain guests with artistic ability without overshadowing them. Education wasn't preparation for a career. It was preparation for a performance. Accomplishments were the primary measure of educational success. A well-educated young woman could fill sketchbooks with graceful studies of flowers and landscapes while maintaining elegant handwriting. She might sing a Schubert piece well enough to impress visiting relatives, or embroider cushions that decorated the drawing room with proof of her diligence. A well-educated young man could quote classical, authors at dinner, recite poetry at will, and display just enough knowledge to appear intelligent without drifting into the impractical territory of genuine intellectual ambition. Tutors and governesses knew this. Their job was not to inspire, it was to refine. They corrected posture during reading lessons. They moderated tone during recitations. They taught not only content but demeanour, how to incline the head, how to hold a book, how to avoid appearing too proud of one's abilities or too ashamed of one's mistakes. Education shaped the body and voice as much as the mind, and when the time came for a child to enter society, their education would be put to the test, not through examinations, but through the reactions of others. Did the young lady sing without trembling? Did she paint without smudging? Did she converse without babbling? Did the young man quote appropriately? Did he avoid arguing? Could he stand still for long periods without looking bored or hungry? These were the true Victorian exams. In the end, education for the wealthy wasn't about empowering the mind. It was about polishing the surface. Knowledge was not the goal. Refinement was. In wealthy Victorian society, marriage was not the climax of a love story. It was the final stage of a financial negotiation. Romantic feelings were optional and often inconvenient. What truly mattered was strategy, alliances, property, inheritance, dowries, reputations, and the careful weaving of two families' futures into a respectable, profitable, and socially advantageous tapestry. You didn't fall in love, you negotiated it. Within the upper class, the idea that one might marry purely for affection was regarded with the same scepticism reserved for unreliable plumbing. Risky, idealistic, and likely to create a mess. Love was charming, yes, but it was not a structural foundation. What a wealthy Victorian family needed from marriage was stability, and stability came from money, assets, and connections. A spouse was not chosen for compatibility of temperament, but compatibility of bank accounts and ancestry charts. A young woman of good family did not date. She was presented. When she reached the appropriate age, not too young, not too old, but precisely at the moment her social bloom was considered optimal, she entered society through a process so ceremonial it made modern job interviews look spontaneous. Balls, dinners, afternoon teas, garden parties, carriage rides. These were her opportunities to be gracefully displayed, subtly evaluated, and quietly measured against other young women in the same glittering marketplace. The goal was not to charm the room, but to fit it. The ideal debutante was poised, polite, well-dressed, softly expressive, and mildly interesting but not too interesting. Her accomplishments, music, drawing, conversation, the ability to faint gracefully, were presented like items on a resume. A potential suitor didn't need to feel passion. He needed to feel confident she would enhance his social standing and not embarrass his mother. Men faced their own pressures. A young gentleman was expected to marry well, a vague term that translated into a complex list of financial and social criteria. Did the young woman come from an established family? Did her dowry support the upkeep of an estate that was inevitably more expensive than anyone admitted? Did her relatives bring prestige, or worse, scandal? A man's choice of bride reflected not only on himself, but on generations of ancestors whose portraits hung on the dining room walls, silently judging his romantic discernment. Matchmaking among the wealthy was a delicate art, practiced by mothers with the focus of battlefield generals and the subtlety of diplomats. They navigated gossip, flirtation, innuendo, and social cues with precision. A well-timed compliment, a strategically arranged dinner seating, or a shared carriage ride could spark the beginning of a respectable match. But behind every seemingly spontaneous meeting lay a carefully orchestrated plan. Mothers exchanged intelligence with the efficiency of spies, rumours of dowry size, whispers of family debt, hints of temperament. All of it mattered, because wealth alone wasn't enough. Reputation had equal weight, A family with money but no pedigree raised suspicions. A family with pedigree but no money raised eyebrows. Marrying into either required delicate calculation. Did the money compensate for the lack of heritage? Did the heritage justify the lack of liquidity? Could the weaknesses of one family be masked by the strengths of the other? Marriage wasn't a union. It was a merger. And once a couple became engaged, the negotiation intensified. Dowry discussions began with polite smiles and ended with accountants hovering over documents. Property transfers were debated. Titles, if involved, were meticulously reviewed. The young pair might exchange letters, but the families exchanged contracts. These arrangements would define the next generation, and no detail could be left to sentiment. In a society where inheritance laws favoured sons, estates had to be protected from mismanagement, scandal, or ill-advised romance. Yet within this rigid system, emotion did sometimes occur. Couples occasionally developed affection, understanding, even love. But those emotions were considered fortunate accidents rather than essential components. Love was a pleasant bonus, a decorative accessory to the marriage, like a well-placed vase or an inherited brooch, but it could not override the financial strategy. Once married, the couple assumed roles shaped by centuries of expectation. The husband managed assets, estates, political duties, and public presence. The wife managed households, social calendars, charitable activities, and the delicate art of influencing her husband without ever appearing to do so. But even inside these roles, marriage remained a financial alliance. First, producing heirs secured property, hosting dinners maintained social ties, maintaining appearances protected the family's long-term position. And yet, beneath the cool practicality, there were moments of tenderness. Marriages arranged for advantage sometimes blossomed into partnerships. Shared duties, shared pressures, shared performances. It all created intimacy of a quiet, restrained kind. Couples learned to understand each other's rhythms, jokes, anxieties, and ambitions. They formed alliances inside the alliance. They built affection inside the contract. Some discovered love slowly, like a plant growing in a room not meant for plants but thriving anyway. Others, of course, did not. There were mismatches, disappointments, and marriages held together by nothing more than duty and shared property. But duty itself was considered noble. Happiness was optional. Respectability was mandatory. In wealthy Victorian society, marriage was less about two people and more about two families, two fortunes, and two futures. It was a practical arrangement wrapped in lace and ceremony, a financial strategy executed with flowers, music, and polite applause. The emotions came later, if they came at all. You didn't fall in love, you negotiated it. For the wealthy Victorian, reputation wasn't simply important, it was existential. Money gave you comfort, status, and options, but reputation determined whether society allowed you to use those things. A tarnished name could close doors faster than creditors. A whispered rumour could undo decades of careful social cultivation. Your fortune was solid. Your reputation was glass. In Victorian society, appearances mattered more than realities. Wealthy families devoted enormous energy to crafting a flawless public image. Polished manners, immaculate clothing, tasteful homes, well-behaved children, strategic marriages, dignified leisure, and emotional restraint so consistent that even their smiles felt curated. But beneath this elegant surface lay a collective fear, the terror that one mistake, one slip, one whisper could fracture everything. Scandal was not simply embarrassing, it was annihilating, and Victorian society loved scandal. It fed on gossip the way plants feed on sunlight. Quietly, constantly, and with alarming enthusiasm. Drawing rooms became rumour exchanges. Afternoon tea became intelligence briefings. Dinner parties weren't just social occasions, they were reconnaissance missions. Everyone observed everyone else, silently cataloguing potential cracks in the facade. A raised eyebrow here, a hint of impropriety there, an awkward pause. Anything could be interpreted as evidence. And if real evidence didn't exist, society felt no shame in inventing it. A wealthy Victorian's greatest fear wasn't financial ruin. It was becoming talked about. Once gossip attached itself to a name, it stuck with the persistence of soot on London fog days. You didn't need to do anything truly scandalous. You only needed to be suspected of doing something that could theoretically lead to something that hinted at scandal. Unsupervised conversation with someone inappropriate? Dangerous. A dress cut slightly too daringly? Reckless. A child misbehaving publicly? Catastrophic. Even silence could be incriminating. Quiet people were often suspected of harbouring secrets. And gossip didn't spread logically. It spread socially, carried by people with excellent hearing and questionable restraint. A single awkward moment could evolve into a full narrative by the time it crossed 3 households. She fainted became, she fainted dramatically, which became, she fainted suspiciously, which blossomed into, she fainted because she hides something. Entire reputations unravelled from misunderstandings involving nothing more than a warm room or a tight corset. The stakes were enormous. A minor scandal could result in fewer invitations, cool glances at social events, or awkward silences when you entered a room. A major scandal could exile a family entirely, socially banished, financially weakened, and burdened with a legacy of humiliation their descendants might still be discussing in therapy, if therapy had existed. For women especially, reputation hovered constantly like a glass ornament held by someone with slippery hands. A young lady who laughed too loudly might be called uncontrolled. One who made bold conversation might be called forward. One who expressed an opinion about politics, philosophy, science, or anything besides flowers and weather risked being labelled unfeminine, which was practically a short step from moral downfall. A single walk in the wrong company could define her for life. Men were granted slightly more leeway, but only slightly. A gentleman's behaviour still shaped the entire family's status. Public drunkenness, gambling debt, flirtations with the wrong people, imprudent business ventures or outbursts of temper could stain not only his name but his wife's, his children's, and in extreme cases the family lineage for generations. Even the hint of impropriety, an unpaid bill, a poorly chosen friendship, a misinterpreted gesture, could follow him into every parlour in London. The fragility of reputation made daily life a balancing act. You spoke carefully, you dressed carefully, you chose acquaintances carefully, you made decisions not based on desire but on the potential social fallout. Genuine emotion had to be hidden because the wealthy Victorian world distrusted anything too real. Anger, indecorous, joy, overly expressive, grief, acceptable in small, tasteful amounts, enthusiasm, suspicious and potentially destabilizing. The system forced people into constant self-surveillance. Even at home, the thought of how one's actions might appear lingered. A wealthy Victorian was never truly unobserved, if not by society, then by their own fear of it. The walls had ears, the neighbours had opinions, and newspapers had column space to fill. To preserve reputation, families developed strategies. They avoided certain social circles. They vetted every visitor. They corrected children immediately, lest a small misbehaviour bloom into whispers of poor upbringing. They cultivated alibis in advance, became masters of polite deflection, and learned the art of smiling without revealing their feelings. And in cases where scandal seemed unavoidable, elite families acted swiftly. They spun narratives. They relocated problematic relatives. They organised sudden trips abroad. They hired lawyers, wrote letters, offered apologies, or, in extreme cases, rewrote the family history with the determination of people who understood the value of selective memory. Yet, ironically, the absolute fragility of reputation created a kind of twisted social intimacy. Everyone understood the rules because everyone feared them, and within that mutual fear, alliances formed. Friends, protected each other's secrets. Acquaintances exchanged warnings under the guise of gossip. Families formed silent pacts, knowing that survival depended on mutual discretion. Victorian society claimed to value morality, but what it truly valued was presentation. The truth could be complicated, messy, human, but reputation had to be spotless. Even a whisper of scandal threatened to crack the entire facade. Your fortune could buy carriages, houses, jewels, and staff, but it could not repair a damaged name. Your fortune was solid, your reputation was glass. In wealthy Victorian society, social visits looked polite, charming, and leisurely, but beneath the lace gloves and the soft conversation lay a competition so intense it could have powered a small empire. People didn't visit each other to enjoy companionship. They visited to measure where everyone stood. Friendships were secondary. Hospitality was strategic. Every exchange operated like a quiet tournament in which no one acknowledged the game. You weren't socializing. You were ranking. It all began with the calling card, a deceptively innocent piece of thick paper that determined the fate of relationships. A calling card wasn't merely a name. It was a statement of identity, intention, and status. Its weight, its font, its corners, even the clarity of its engraving spoke volumes. Too plain, and you looked provincial. Too ornate, and you looked desperate. It had to signal refinement without trying too hard, an artistic middle ground that only the socially fluent could navigate. Visiting someone required choreography. You never arrived unannounced unless you wished to imply moral chaos. Instead, you presented your card at the door and waited for the servant to deliver your fate. If the family was not at home, this could mean two things. They were genuinely out, or they were at home but pretending otherwise to avoid you. Both options were acceptable. What mattered was how often they were not at home when you arrived. If they did accept the visit, you were escorted into a drawing room, a carefully staged environment designed to convey elegance and, more importantly, superiority. The arrangement of chairs indicated hierarchy. The placement of ornaments suggested taste. Even the quality of the tea communicated something about the hostess's confidence. If she served the good tea, she was showing respect. If she served the mediocre tea, she was testing you. Once seated, the performance began. Conversation drifted across topics that were safe, refined, and utterly devoid of substance. Weather, roses, travel, recent concerts, the colour of the room's wallpaper, anything that affirmed everyone's civility while revealing nothing about their inner lives. Victorians didn't share opinions, they shared atmospheres. A social visit was an exercise in floating above reality like well-dressed ghosts. But while the words spoken were mild, the silence beneath them was packed with analysis. Every gesture was evaluated. Was the hostess's smile slightly stiff? Did she offer biscuits, or was she merely pretending to be generous? Did she mention recent events that subtly indicated she had been invited somewhere you had not? Did she compliment your dress in a tone that suggested competitive calculation? Social visits were diagnostic tools for identifying shifts in the hierarchy, all performed with flawless grace. Staying too long was a social crime. A proper visit lasted precisely 15 minutes, long enough to establish cordiality, short enough to avoid implying attachment. You arrived, you chatted, you admired something decorative, you sipped tea without spilling it, and you left just before your presence became tedious. Overstaying meant ignorance of social rhythm. Leaving too soon meant arrogance. Timing was everything. Hosting, too, was a competitive art. A wealthy household's reputation depended heavily on the quality of its visits. The drawing room needed to be immaculate, the furniture perfectly arranged, and the conversation flowing with the proper balance of warmth and restraint. Hosts competed not in explicit ways, but in subtle nuances. The elegance of the tea service, the grace of the hostess's posture, the tastefulness of the decorations, and the ease with which the servant opened the door. Even the speed at which guests were received communicated status. Immediately answering the door could seem too eager, Making visitors wait too long bordered on insult. The calling card ritual escalated this competition. Returning a card wasn't just a courtesy, it was a ranked response. A single card meant basic acknowledgement. 2 cards meant respect. Cards delivered personally showed commitment. Cards delivered via servant-suggested distance. If you left your card in an envelope, it implied a particularly strategic level of formality. Victorians turned greeting cards into social weaponry with astonishing precision. And then there was the pinnacle event of the social calendar, the at-home day. On this designated afternoon, a lady announced she would be at home to receive visitors. The more prestigious her circle, the more crowded the event. Guests arrived in a steady stream, each bearing their card, their smiles, and their silent determination not to appear overly enthusiastic about being included. If no one came, disaster. If too many came, triumph. But either way, participants observed everything. The hostess's manner, the quality of refreshments, the mix of invitees, and any signs of tension or favouritism. Because in Victorian society, hosting was not simply hospitality, it was declaration. It announced your social stamina, your connections, your taste, your confidence, and your willingness to perform the exhausting emotional labour required to maintain elite status. People hosted to display their place in the hierarchy, and people visited to judge whether that place was deserved. Even departures were competitive. You curtsied or bowed with exacting grace. You stepped out of the drawing room as though leaving a stage. Your carriage awaited, not too close to the door, not too far. You rode away with the appearance of calm satisfaction, privately making notes about your hostess's dress, the taste of her tea, and the suspiciously ostentatious flower arrangement on the mantel. By the time you returned home, the visit may have lasted a mere quarter hour, but the social implications lingered like perfume. Would the hostess return your call? Would you receive another invitation? Had you risen slightly in the invisible rankings, or slid? Social visits looked like niceties, but they functioned like scorekeeping. Victorians mastered the art of smiling through competition. You weren't visiting friends, you were assessing rivals. In the world of wealthy Victorian society, every polite gesture carried meaning. Every social call updated the rankings. In wealthy Victorian society, emotional restraint wasn't just expected, it was required with the same level of seriousness typically reserved for religious commandments or household budgeting. Feelings were tolerated, but only if they were trimmed, polished, and tucked neatly behind a mask of composure. To display your inner world openly was not considered brave, honest, or relatable. It was considered undignified. You had emotions, you just hid them well. Victorians believed deeply in moral self-control. A refined person did not flail, shout, weep publicly, or reveal excitement. Emotional expressions were handled with the delicacy of handling fine china, lightly, rarely, and with extreme caution. Happiness could be acknowledged, but never exuberantly. Anger could be felt, but never shown. Sadness was permitted only in tasteful quantities, and ideally accompanied by poetic language. Passion? Absolutely not. Passion was for the theatre, or worse, for the lower classes. This emotional discipline was woven into everyday life. A wealthy Victorian began each day by putting on composure as deliberately as they put on clothing. Smiles were measured, voices were moderated, posture was adjusted. Even laughter had rules, soft, brief, and polite, ideally occurring behind a gloved hand. Loud laughter suggested either uninhibited joy, dangerous, or lack of breeding, catastrophic. People laughed the way one might carefully open a window during a storm, just enough to let out pressure, never enough to risk damage. Anger was the most forbidden emotion. Expressing anger indicated a collapse of self-discipline, and in Victorian society self-discipline was the backbone of respectability. If someone insulted you, you did not raise your voice, you did not pace the room, you did not throw anything. You responded with a chilly politeness that suggested the other person had just committed a grave offence against civilization itself. The frost in your tone did the work your temper wished it could do. Disappointment, too, required restraint. If life didn't go your way, you sighed. Quietly. Elegantly. A refined sigh was an art form, one that conveyed just enough emotion to prove your humanity, but not enough to disrupt the surrounding decorum. If a serious disappointment occurred, say your child refused to practice piano, or your silk gown arrived with a wrinkle, you retired to another room to compose yourself, allowing your servants to pretend they didn't hear the muffled sound of you attempting to outsigh the situation. Joy, ironically, was also dangerous. Too much happiness indicated impulsiveness. Getting visibly excited about good news made you look unpredictable, and unpredictability was terrifying to Victorians. A refined person accepted good fortune with a serene nod, as though they had expected it all along. Even at weddings where joy was officially allowed, emotions remained controlled. A tear was acceptable. More than one tear risked implying an inability to manage oneself. Children absorbed these expectations early. They learned that emotional transparency was a sign of immaturity, and immaturity was shameful. A child crying in public was whisked away instantly, not because the parents didn't care, but because every tear threatened their social image. Children train their voices into gentle tones and suppress tantrums with the rigour of small, anxious diplomats. Even happiness had to fit into the narrow spectrum of acceptability. Romantic feelings were handled with extraordinary discipline. Open displays of affection were frowned upon, even between married couples. Love letters existed, but their emotional content was filtered through metaphors, formalities, and compliments that carefully avoided sounding too earnest. After all, genuine vulnerability was socially dangerous. Victorians did not say, "I love you." They said, "I remain affectionately yours," which translated to, "I care about you, but let's not make a scene." Grief was perhaps the emotion with the most elaborate guidelines. Mourning required strict rules of dress, behaviour, and duration. You could grieve deeply. Victorian culture embraced the idea of sorrow as a moral trial, but you had to do it correctly. Public displays of grief were choreographed. Tears were acceptable only in controlled environments. Dramatic mourning was tolerated only if it adhered to the conventions of tragedy. In essence, even grief had a code of conduct. Underneath these rigid expectations was a cultural conviction that emotions were threatening. Excessive joy might lead to recklessness. Excessive sadness might lead to impropriety. Excessive anger might lead to scandal. Excessive affection might lead to gossip. Excessive anything might lead to social catastrophe. So Victorians mastered the art of minimalism, showing the least amount possible while communicating what was necessary. And of course, the wealthy were experts at suppressing emotions around servants. Being witnessed in a moment of unguarded feeling was mortifying. A servant entering at the wrong moment could see you mid-frown, mid-sigh, or mid-thought, and that small lapse could ripple through the household's perception. So you composed yourself whenever footsteps approached, creating a constant low-level vigilance that trained your facial muscles into permanent serenity. It wasn't that Victorians lacked feelings. They had them in abundance, but they believed that the difference between refinement and chaos was the ability to maintain calm in the face of everything life attempted to throw at you. Emotional control signaled self-respect, discipline, and membership in the cultivated class. Victorian society loved the idea of passion in novels, operas, and plays, but in real life, passion belonged somewhere else, preferably far away in Italy, under controlled circumstances. In the world of the wealthy Victorian, emotions did not vanish. They merely learned to perform behind a curtain. You had emotions, you just hid them well. For the wealthy Victorian, healthcare was not a science, it was a spectacle. Rich families had access to doctors, specialists, imported remedies, cutting-edge devices, spa retreats, and an impressive array of bottles that promised vitality, clarity, and the general absence of death. But access did not mean accuracy. Victorian medicine existed in a curious twilight zone where scientific innovation mingled freely with superstition, guesswork, and unregulated enthusiasm from people who sincerely believed they understood the human body. You weren't cured, you were enthusiastically treated. The Victorian upper class adored medical trends. A new theory didn't require proof. It required charm, confidence, and preferably a doctor with both a beard and conviction. If he spoke firmly, carried a leather bag, and made dramatic pronouncements about the liver, he was halfway to being hired. The wealthy loved the idea of health just as passionately as they misunderstood it. Illness wasn't merely physical. It was a sign of imbalance, temperament, moral weakness, or unfavourable air currents. Treatments targeted everything except the actual problem. Take the concept of nervous disorders. Wealthy Victorians were convinced they suffered from them constantly. Nervousness was the fashionable illness of the era, mysterious, unpredictable, and conveniently vague. Doctors prescribed rest cures, tonics, sea air, poetry, or simply lying in a darkened room while contemplating the burdens of being refined. Women were told their nerves were too delicate. Men were told their nerves were too taxed. Either way, nerves kept doctors employed. Then there were the tonics, bottles filled with liquids of unknown origin, marketed with such optimism that no one dared question them. These tonics promised to treat everything: melancholy, fatigue, sleeplessness, poor digestion, weak spirits, moral uncertainty, and the vague feeling that something might be wrong. Ingredients varied, but many contained alcohol, opium, coca leaf extract, or combinations thereof. Improvements in mood were immediate, but the reasons were chemical rather than curative. Home remedies flourished too: mustard plasters for chest congestion, leeches for fevers, vinegar compresses for headaches, hot irons for aches, cold baths for excess vitality, warm baths for insufficient vitality. If a remedy contradicted another remedy, that was irrelevant. Victorians believed firmly in variety. The point wasn't consistency, the point was participation. And then there was the great obsession with air. Victorians believed that bad air, miasma, caused illness, which meant wealthy homes were designed, ventilated, and rearranged with almost religious fervour. Windows were opened, then closed, then partially opened, depending on the season, the doctor, and the mood of the household. Entire rooms went unused because someone believed a draught had murderous intent. A wealthy Victorian could be fatally suspicious of air while simultaneously trusting a tonic containing ingredients that would later require government regulation. Water treatments too became stylish. Hydrotherapy clinics promised to cleanse the body through baths, plunges, sprays, and wraps, performed by attendants who wielded water like a blunt instrument. Patients were submerged, doused, wrapped, chilled, or steamed depending on their diagnosis. Some reported improvement, some reported frostbite. Most reported that they felt something, which was enough to consider the treatment successful. Electric treatments were the newest novelty. Wealthy households purchased devices that delivered controlled shocks to muscles and nerves, believing electricity could restore vigour. Doctors endorsed them enthusiastically, and salesmen guaranteed results. Patients felt tingling, jolting, or spasming. Unmistakable evidence that something was happening, whether helpful or not. Electricity was modern. Modern meant impressive. Impressive meant therapeutic. And of course, exercise became popular, but not too popular. Vigorous activity risked perspiration, which risked staining clothing, which risked shame. So Victorians invented gentler options: calisthenics with minimal movement, outdoor strolls paced for elegance rather than efficiency, horseback riding that emphasised posture over speed. Men took fencing or cricket lessons, but only to display discipline, not to develop strength. Women performed light gymnastics, which involved stretching in full skirts while maintaining facial serenity. Dietary treatments were equally creative. Some doctors advised patients to avoid heavy meats. Others insisted meat was essential for vitality. Some discouraged sweets. Others recommended medicinal chocolate. Some warned against rich sauces, while others believed spices stimulated the soul. The wealthy oscillated between dietary philosophies with the enthusiasm of people who trusted every published opinion and none of their own instincts. But the true peak of Victorian medical fashion was the spa town, Bath, Buxton, Brighton, and countless others, where the wealthy flocked to immerse themselves in waters rumoured to cure everything from gout to sorrow. Spa towns were less about health and more about social performance. People visited, drank mineral water, which tasted like metallic regret, bathed in warm pools, and returned home cured mainly of boredom. But the experience mattered. If society believed the waters were healing, then simply visiting meant you had taken control of your well-being. Surprisingly, some progress did occur. This was the age when germ theory began emerging. A few forward-thinking doctors, rare, often ridiculed, suggested washing hands between procedures or keeping surgical tools clean. Their ideas sounded bizarre, even dangerous, because they contradicted centuries of tradition. But slowly, very slowly, Victorian medicine shifted towards science. Still, most wealthy Victorians preferred treatments that aligned with their worldview, dramatic, elegant, and rooted in the belief that illness could be soothed by refinement. Health wasn't a problem to solve. It was an experience to curate, a story to narrate, a condition to manage with dignity. Doctors provided reassurance. Remedies provided excitement. Treatments provided spectacle. Cures, those were optional. In Victorian medicine, the wealthy weren't necessarily healed. They were simply treated with great enthusiasm. For the wealthy Victorian, travel wasn't a vacation. It was a declaration. Movement across countries, cities and landscapes signalled education, culture, refinement, and most importantly, social belonging. You didn't travel to rest, reflect, or escape responsibilities. You travelled to announce, with the subtlety of a steam engine, that you were a person of means, intellect and leisure. You didn't travel to relax. You travelled to qualify. The pinnacle of elite travel was the Grand Tour, a multi-month, sometimes multi-year expedition through Europe, undertaken by young aristocrats finishing their education. The purpose wasn't entertainment. It was transformation, turning a somewhat polished young adult into a fully polished social product capable of discussing art, architecture, literature, and the correct pronunciation of Italian opera composers. A gentleman who had not travelled was unfinished, like a chair missing its final coat of varnish. For young men, the Grand Tour followed an unwritten itinerary. Paris for charm, Switzerland for character-building landscapes, Italy for art and sudden emotional enlightenment, Germany for seriousness, and possibly Greece if the family purse was generous. Each city offered lessons. Paris taught style, manners, and the importance of appearing unimpressed. Rome taught history so dense that even the ruins seemed exhausted. Florence taught taste, which was crucial because a man without taste risked marrying poorly and decorating his house worse. Women did not embark on full grand tours in the same way. Respectability required limits, but elite families arranged extended travels for daughters under careful supervision. A chaperoned journey through France or Italy demonstrated cultivation without danger, giving a young woman exposure to culture, languages, and mildly seductive foreign air, while ensuring she never stood too close to fountains or charming men with poetic sorrow in their eyes. But beyond the Grand Tour, everyday elite travel flourished. Train networks expanded, steamships became reliable, hotels multiplied. Suddenly, even short trips carried enormous social weight. Wealthy Victorians flocked to spas, resorts, and coastal towns, not because they needed the break, but because society expected them to move. Remaining in one place too long suggested stagnation, and stagnation hinted at financial trouble. Travel became the wealthy person's version of posting life updates, a way to prove they were thriving. Destination was everything. Brighton meant fashionable sea air. Bath meant sophistication and mineral waters with questionable flavours. Edinburgh meant intellectual aspirations. Paris meant glamour and spending too much on fabric. The Swiss Alps meant health, vigour, and an impressive tolerance for thin air. Even the act of travelling became part of the performance. Wealthy families boarded trains with an entourage, trunks, hat boxes, writing desks, tea baskets, shawls, lap blankets, travel pillows, parasols, portable inkstands, and servants who looked distinctly unimpressed by the entire process. It wasn't uncommon for a family of 4 to travel with luggage sufficient to outfit a small military battalion. A well-packed trunk didn't just contain clothing, it contained identity. Then there were the guidebooks. Victorian tourists carried detailed volumes explaining where to stand, what to admire, how long to admire it, and which parts of foreign culture should be appreciated politely rather than sincerely. Guidebooks taught wealthy travellers how to have the correct reactions, ensuring their emotional responses stayed within the boundaries of appropriateness. Nothing was left to chance, including enthusiasm. Travel also came with social obligations. You had to write letters home describing what you learned. Not what you felt, but what you learned. Descriptions of landscapes, museums, ruins, churches, and scenic views filled pages, each demonstrating that your journey was improving you. Intellectual growth was mandatory. If you saw something simply because it was beautiful, you kept that private. Beauty without educational value was considered frivolous, and of course souvenirs were essential. Wealthy Victorians returned home with crates of artwork, sculptures, tapestries, carved trinkets, geological samples, and occasionally items of questionable legality. Collection of souvenirs revealed not just where you had been, but who you had become. The more objects you acquired, the more convincingly you could prove your cultural evolution. Guests entering your home didn't need to ask if you travelled. They could see the evidence displayed with the subtlety of a museum curated by someone who enjoyed bragging through porcelain. Not all travel was glamorous. Roads could be rough, trains crowded, seasickness common. But discomfort didn't matter. Travel was a badge of honour, and badges of honour were worth the nausea. Even unpleasant journeys served a purpose. They allowed the wealthy to return home with dramatic stories that enhanced their social aura. Complaining about European roads was practically a Victorian sport. But the deeper truth behind Victorian travel was this. Movement signalled freedom. To travel was to prove you had the time, money, and social permission to leave your home for extended periods. Ordinary people travelled for work, survival, or necessity. Wealthy Victorians travelled to confirm their identity, and to display it upon return. Travel expanded horizons, yes, but it also reinforced class boundaries. Only those with means could spend weeks studying Renaissance art or lounging beside mineral springs while discussing the appropriate temperature for healing waters. Even the act of returning home carried symbolism. When you stepped back into society after months abroad, you appeared renewed, smarter, more fashionable, more cosmopolitan. You had seen the world, and by doing so you elevated yourself within your own. In Victorian society, staying home meant nothing was happening. Travelling meant everything was continuing exactly as it should. You didn't journey for pleasure, you journeyed for proof. You didn't travel to relax, you travelled to qualify. For the wealthy Victorian, charity was not simply a virtue, it was an event. It was a performance staged upon the broad, glittering platform of public opinion. Giving was not done in quiet corners or anonymous envelopes. Giving was done with visibility, ceremony, and ideally a small audience murmuring appreciatively nearby. You gave from the heart, loudly. Philanthropy was considered both a moral duty and a social necessity. Wealth demanded proof that it was being used for more than just imported wallpaper and stately discomfort. A respectable family was expected to contribute to the improvement of society, specifically the parts of society that could be improved through respectable distance. Charity reassured everyone, including the donors themselves, that they possessed compassion, humanity, and the appropriate level of benevolence required to justify ownership of 40-room estates. But here's the truth. Charity in Victorian high society operated with rules, rituals, and expectations every bit as complex as formal dining. One could not simply decide to be charitable. One had to be charitable correctly. A wealthy Victorian, woman often served as the moral ambassador of the household's philanthropy. Her charitable work demonstrated refinement, empathy, and social leadership, qualities essential for someone who spent the rest of her time managing drawing room flower arrangements and pretending not to notice furniture that looked too modern. She attended committee meetings, organised bazaars, and presided over charitable teas where cucumber sandwiches served as currency for goodwill. These gatherings displayed generosity while conveniently ensuring everyone had an opportunity to notice each other's outfits, manners, and recent accomplishments. Charitable committees were social hubs disguised as benevolent institutions. Meetings were held in drawing rooms so polished that even the cause of poverty felt underdressed. Well-meaning ladies gathered to discuss water pumps, clothing drives, orphanages, relief funds, and school improvements, but discussions were intertwined with delicate assessments of who had shown up, who had not, and who was quietly slipping in the rankings. Even philanthropy required a seating plan. But while women handled the social mechanics of charity, men offered public endorsement. Wealthy Victorian men rarely involved themselves in the details, but they stood behind philanthropic efforts like dignified, well-tailored exclamation marks. They donated funds that committees had politely requested. They attended luncheons where speeches about morality were given with the earnestness of parliamentary hearings. They signed their names to charitable initiatives that their wives had coordinated entirely on their behalf. A man's reputation for benevolence depended heavily on his wife's workload. Public subscription lists were a hallmark of Victorian charity, and an excellent example of generosity requiring witnesses. When donating to a cause, individuals' names were published alongside the amount given. This system created a fascinating social phenomenon. Everyone wanted to appear generous, but no one wanted to appear too generous, in case it sparked rumours of arrogance or financial instability. Donations became mathematical performances. Give too little, and you looked cold-hearted. Give too much, and you risked being accused of showing off, or worse, of having more money than your peers, which created its own brand of resentment. Public giving had another advantage. It allowed the wealthy to cultivate a moral narrative. A family might be whispered about for questionable behaviour, but if they donated to the right causes, society could be persuaded to forget inconvenient details. Charity acted like a social laundering service, polishing reputations until they shone as brightly as the silver tea sets displayed at fundraising events. Generosity softened scandal, redirected gossip, and reassured the public that the donors were proper Victorians who understood duty. But despite all these strategic functions, many philanthropic efforts genuinely did help people. Wealthy donors funded schools, clinics, soup kitchens, orphanages, and temperance societies. They contributed to the construction of parks, libraries, and public fountains. They supported missionary work abroad and relief campaigns for catastrophes at home. Their charity shaped cities, expanded opportunities, and occasionally demonstrated sincere compassion. However, even when motivated by real concern, such efforts remained wrapped in the social necessity of being seen to care. Even the act of visiting the poor had rules. A wealthy lady performed charity with gloves on, posture straight, and emotions contained. She brought blankets, clothing, and food, but she also brought her sense of correct behaviour, ensuring she demonstrated just enough empathy without compromising the dignity demanded of her position. No one wanted to appear too moved by suffering. displays of intense compassion risked emotional impropriety. Fundraising events became spectacles of moral theatre. Fancy fairs offered goods made by wealthy hands, embroidered handkerchiefs, knitted gloves, amateur paintings, sold to raise money for noble causes. Bazaars featured decorated stalls, raffles, and polite crowds congratulating each other on being good people. Concerts raised funds while offering opportunities for young ladies to perform music that subtly advertised their accomplishments. Charity balls allowed the wealthy to dance for the greater good, confident that their costumes and hairstyles were contributing to society. The irony was delicious. Many charities aimed to address problems indirectly caused or worsened by the social structures the wealthy themselves benefited from. But Victorian philanthropy was not designed to examine contradictions. It was designed to demonstrate moral participation, to prove that one was not merely rich, but responsibly rich. And so, Victorian charity remained a blend of genuine goodwill and strategic performance. It soothed consciences, reinforced reputations, offered social opportunities, and provided visible evidence that the wealthy were contributing members of society, as long as someone was watching. In the end, generosity was less about transforming the world and more about confirming your place within it. You gave from the heart, loudly. For all the splendour of wealthy Victorian life, lavish dinners, sprawling estates, wardrobes engineered for impressive suffering, one truth remained stubbornly inescapable. Comfort was not guaranteed. In fact, comfort often lagged decades behind fortune. A wealthy Victorian could float through society with jewels worth a townhouse, but still spend half the year shivering indoors. You were rich. You were still cold. The Victorian era loved technological progress in theory. In practice, though, innovation had a habit of arriving late, breaking frequently, or threatening to explode unexpectedly. Wealth gave you the privilege of trying new comforts, but not the assurance they would actually work. The wealthiest households resembled elegant laboratories, full of experimental luxuries that promised convenience and delivered bewilderment. Heating was the first great betrayal. Enormous mansions looked magnificent in portraits, but those portraits didn't mention the temperature. Heating relied on fireplaces, and fireplaces relied on burning an unreasonable amount of coal while doing a questionable job of making rooms warm. A mansion could have 24 fireplaces blazing at once and still offer indoor temperatures ideal for storing cheese. You might warm your front half while your back remained frozen, resulting in a social scene where guests rotated before the fire like polite rotisserie chickens. Servants raced constantly to keep fires lit, stoke coals, clean grates, and prevent rogue embers from setting the drapes ablaze. A very real threat that made cosy evenings as relaxing as standing too close to a dragon, even the richest. Households, despite their armies of staff, could not escape drafts. Houses were so large and so poorly insulated that they created their own indoor climates. A hallway could feel like October, the library like February, and the conservatory like late April, all on the same afternoon. And then came the newest innovation, central heating. It existed, but only in prototype form, powered by water systems that clanked ominously, hissed unexpectedly, and occasionally flooded the basement. Wealthy Victorians adored the idea of central heating, but those who actually installed it often found their homes transformed into tepid steam caves. The technology wasn't reliable, and even when it worked, houses were simply too massive for heat to reach more than 2 rooms at a time. A rich Victorian could brag about modern heating at dinner, while wearing 3 layers indoors. Lighting brought similar contradictions. Before gaslighting, candles illuminated homes with a warm but faint glow. After gaslighting arrived, rooms became dramatically brighter and more dangerous. Gas pipes hissed in the walls. Fixtures flickered unpredictably. Leaks produced noxious fumes that could render a drawing room uninhabitable faster than a poorly rehearsed piano performance. Gaslighting created dazzling atmospheres for receptions and dinners, but it also raised the possibility that your chandelier might explode during dessert. And installing gas lines, That was a nightmare. Contractors tore through walls, ceilings and plaster, behaving with the finesse of moles searching for treasure. Once installed, pipes required constant monitoring. Too much gas pressure could blacken ceilings. Too little left visitors squinting at their soup. Even the grandest mansions lived with the low hum of uncertainty. Was that faint smell of sulphur normal? Or should everyone quietly move away from the fireplace before the room became airborne? Electric lighting emerged later in the century and impressed the wealthy tremendously, but early electric systems were notoriously temperamental. Bulbs burned out quickly, wires overheated, and generators made alarming noises that suggested electricity was a phenomenon not entirely convinced it wished to be domesticated. Wealthy Victorians installed electric lights proudly, then left half the house candlelit just in case. Plumbing offered its own unique blend of aspiration and chaos. Running water was a coveted luxury, but early systems were unreliable. Pipes froze in winter, leaked in spring, burst unpredictably, or delivered water with the faint aroma of whatever metal they were constructed from. Hot water systems existed, but only the bold or the desperate trusted them. Geysers and boilers required precision. Too little heat, and your bath was lukewarm misery. Too much, and your bath attempted to boil you alive. Servants often stood guard during baths not for modesty, but for fire safety. Toilets, the pride of modern Victorian innovation, were equally inconsistent. Early flush systems were prone to clogging, overflowing, or dramatic roaring noises that startled houseguests. Wealthy homes might boast multiple indoor toilets, but every one of them required coaxing, maintenance, and the underlying acceptance that it might rebel at any moment. The dream of effortless sanitation often collided with the reality of porcelain unpredictability. Even ventilation, touted as essential for health, created more problems than it solved. Houses built with high ceilings and generous windows aimed to encourage airflow, but airflow meant drafts, and drafts meant illness, or at least the fear of illness. Victorians believed strongly that breezes could cause everything from headaches to moral decline. So the wealthy spent their days negotiating with windows, opening them a cautious inch or closing them at the slightest hint of movement, trying desperately to balance fresh air with not freezing to death. Comfort, in other words, was a daily negotiation between wealth, technology, and the stubborn realities of Victorian architecture. You might dine beneath crystal chandeliers while shivering gently. You might enjoy a luxurious bath while worrying whether the boiler was making unfamiliar noises. You might boast about your modern lighting while discreetly checking for gas leaks. The wealthy could afford the newest comforts, but new didn't mean effective. New meant experimental. New meant unpredictable. New meant this may improve life or it may destroy the East Wing. In the end, Victorian luxury was more about appearance than bodily ease. Homes looked magnificent. Rooms dazzled. Guests were impressed. But comfort lagged behind style with the persistence of a servant carrying hot water up 5 flights of stairs. For the wealthy Victorian, life came with a paradox so sharp it could cut through velvet. The more you had, the more you feared losing it. Comfort, luxury, and status were undeniably pleasant, but they were fragile, precarious, conditional. One misstep, one rumour, one bad investment, one poorly timed marriage, one social error committed in the wrong drawing room, and the entire structure could shudder. You had everything except peace. In Victorian society, class was not a static condition. It was a performance, a watchful exercise, a perpetual audition for the role of respectable person in good standing. Even those born into wealth felt the ground shifting beneath them. Aristocrats fretted over dwindling estates. Industrialists worried about appearing too nouveau. Landowners feared the rise of merchants. Merchants feared the disdain of the aristocracy. Aristocrats feared irrelevance, and everyone feared gossip. Status had to be earned, displayed, defended, polished, and protected on a daily basis. And the danger was everywhere. reputation, that delicate currency, could evaporate like mist. But equally threatening was economic instability, a spectre hiding behind the heavy curtains of many Victorian mansions. Estates required constant maintenance, and maintenance required money. Money for staff, for repairs, for appearances. Yet many families had land without liquidity, meaning they lived in magnificent homes they could barely heat. Industrial fortunes rose quickly but could collapse just as fast, tied to markets, machinery, and the whims of innovation. Even the richest households knew that a single financial crisis could transform them from subjects of admiration into subjects of whispered pity. This fear created a tension visible in the smallest decisions. The guest list for a dinner party was strategic. Accepting or declining invitations required careful judgment. Wearing last season's fashion risked signalling financial strain. Donating too little to a charity event looked miserly. Donating too much looked like overcompensation, or worse, a reckless attempt to impress creditors. Every gesture carried implications, and every implication carried consequences. For women, class anxiety permeated daily life with particular sharpness. A lady's success was measured not only by her own conduct, but by her children's manners, her husband's reputation, and her household's appearance. If the silver was tarnished, if the servants misbehaved, if the children fidgeted in public, if her dress looked slightly worn, society interpreted these details with forensic enthusiasm. A lady's social rank didn't simply reflect her birth or wealth. It reflected her ongoing labour to appear serene while juggling responsibilities that would have driven lesser mortals into the nearest horse pond. For men, the pressures manifested differently, but no less intensely. They were expected to project stability, competence, and inherited confidence, even when juggling debts, navigating political rivalries, or quietly panicking about a business venture that had begun to wobble. Losing money was disastrous, but appearing as though one might lose money was nearly as bad. Men maintained stoic expressions while internally calculating the cost of coal, the fluctuating price of wheat, and the uncomfortable rumour that the neighbouring baronet had mortgaged his estate. The competitive nature of Victorian society made class anxiety not just personal, but communal. Everyone compared themselves to everyone else. Drawing rooms buzzed with subtle one-upmanship, whose sons were accepted into elite schools, whose daughters received the best proposals, whose parlour was redecorated by the most fashionable designer, whose carriage appeared newest, whose annual trip abroad seemed longest, whose charity work seemed most admired. You didn't participate in society to enjoy it. You participated to avoid falling behind. And yet, ironically, the very people the wealthy feared slipping behind were often the newly rich. Industrial families whose fortunes grew faster than old families could polish their portraits. This created a cultural tug-of-war. The old elite clung to lineage. The new elite flaunted money. Both groups eyed each other with the polite hostility of rivals forced to share a ballroom. Aristocrats worried that new money lacked refinement. New money worried that aristocrats lacked solvency. Everyone worried about being replaced. Even within families, the anxiety simmered. Parents pressured children to excel socially, so the next generation could maintain rank. Daughters were groomed like diplomatic assets, trained to secure marriages that strengthened alliances. Sons were trained to uphold the family name, preserve estates, and avoid scandal. A misbehaving child didn't just embarrass parents, it threatened the family's long-term social strategy. Servants observed all of this, of course. They saw the polished exterior and the worried glances, the grand gestures and the whispered concerns. And though they were expected to remain silent, their knowledge contributed to the atmosphere. The wealthy feared being judged not only by peers but by those who worked within their walls. A butler's raised eyebrow could convey a universe of critique. The physical structure of life also reinforced anxiety. Grand homes decayed constantly. Repairs were costly. Furniture wore out faster than pride allowed. The wealthy lived surrounded by objects that reflected status, and the moment those objects showed wear, so did the illusion of stability. A cracked vase, a faded curtain, a squeaky hinge, all suggested that time and pressure were catching up. Appearance had to be preserved at all costs. And so, wealthy Victorians cultivated calm exteriors while navigating storms beneath the surface. Even moments of leisure were tinged with calculation. A trip abroad needed to signal prosperity. A picnic needed to suggest ease. A dinner party needed to affirm one's continued standing. Life became a performance of effortless superiority, performed by people who were anything but effortless and far from feeling superior. In truth, the wealthy Victorian lived inside a paradox they could never escape. They possessed enormous comfort, yet feared its fragility. They enjoyed enormous privilege, yet dreaded losing it. They held everything, except peace. Victorian society loved wealth, celebrated it, admired it, built entire etiquette systems around it, but only when that wealth came with the correct genealogy. Money was welcome. The people who earned it were negotiable. When industrial fortunes exploded onto the scene in the 19th century, they didn't just disrupt the economy, they disrupted society. Suddenly, new families appeared with fortunes big enough to buy country estates, hire armies of servants, build ornate townhouses, and install chandeliers so heavy they threatened the structural integrity of every ceiling beneath them. But wealth alone wasn't enough. You could afford anything, except belonging. The old aristocracy, the families whose ancestors had been knighted, or at least toasted centuries earlier, viewed the rise of industrial millionaires with the alarm of people watching someone rearrange their furniture without asking. These ancestral families had land, lineage, titles, dusty portraits, and a very firm belief in their superiority. They also often had less actual money than their new industrial counterparts, thanks to enormous estates that hemorrhaged cash through upkeep, tenants who couldn't pay rent, and roofs that required constant maintenance. Still, they clung fiercely to the hierarchy. Money made you wealthy. Lineage made you worthy. Enter the nouveau riche, businessmen who made fortunes in railways, textiles, steel, shipping, banking, or any industry that involved innovation, risk, ambition, and the occasional explosion. They built palatial homes with central heating, still prone to misbehaviour. They bought art, funded charities, hosted lavish soirees, and sent their children to polished schools. They did everything. The aristocracy did, sometimes better, and yet acceptance remained elusive. The problem was simple. Old families believed status could not be earned. It could only be inherited. New money families believed status should be earned, especially if they had earned everything else already. This created a tension so thick it could have been bottled and sold as a Victorian cure-all. The aristocrats critiqued new money with surgical precision. Their homes were too modern. Their gardens were overly ambitious. Their table service was excessively polished. Their clothing was fashionable to the point of vulgarity. Even their enthusiasm for spending money was suspect. Old families believed wealth should be displayed with the same subtlety as a ghost, present but barely visible. New money families, meanwhile, were baffled by these unwritten rules. They learned quickly that aristocratic subtlety was not a sign of modesty, but a sign of ancient comfort, the kind that came from having had the same furniture for 200 years. They learned that redecorating too frequently signalled insecurity. They learned that expressing excitement about wealth was considered gauche. They learned that aristocrats disapproved of people who worked for their fortunes, even as those same fortunes were the only thing keeping aristocratic estates solvent through quiet financial arrangements. Some new money families tried to buy acceptance by purchasing land. Surely, they thought, owning a grand estate would elevate their standing. Instead, old families viewed these purchases with suspicion, as though the new owner had kidnapped the manor rather than purchased it legally. Buying an estate did not give you a family tree. It merely gave you a roof that would cost you the rest of your life. Others tried philanthropy. They donated generously to hospitals, schools, libraries, and relief societies. This improved their reputations, but only to the extent that old families acknowledged their usefulness. Useful was not the same as equal. The ultimate proof of acceptance, of course, was marriage, but even here complications flourished. Aristocratic daughters with impeccable pedigrees but shrinking dowries looked appealing to wealthy industrialists. Aristocratic mothers, however, felt differently. They knew that marrying into new money risked associating the family name with business, an occupation considered tolerable only when performed discreetly and preferably by someone else's sons. The ideal Victorian gentleman was expected to possess income but not a profession. New money men had far too much of the latter. Some families, desperate to preserve their estates, forged alliances anyway. A title-rich but cash-poor aristocrat would marry a wealthy industrialist's daughter. The union benefited everyone. The aristocrat regained financial footing, and the industrialist gained a page in Debrett's peerage. But even then the whispers continued. Old families said the marriage was strategic. New families said it was a triumph. Society said nothing aloud, but kept detailed score. Even social events emphasized the divide. Old elites preferred traditions, quiet dinners, well-bred conversation, and gatherings that had been conducted the same way since the Georgian era. New money families preferred spectacle, illumination, novelty, orchestras, imported champagne, and occasionally fountains that shot coloured water into the air. Aristocrats attended these parties reluctantly, standing stiffly near potted plants while trying to decide whether they were impressed or horrified. The tension extended into language. Aristocrats described their wealth as a heritage. New money described it as success. Aristocrats valued restraint. New money valued improvement. Aristocrats valued history. New money valued progress. They moved through the same society but lived in different worlds. Yet the most amusing irony of all was this. While the old elite pretended to disdain new wealth, they depended on it. Banks run by industrial families helped fund aristocratic debts. Railways built by new money allowed aristocrats to reach their estates quickly. Factories operated by the nouveau riche produced the very textiles aristocrats wore. New money was reshaping the Victorian world, and everyone knew it. Still, acceptance remained the one commodity no amount of fortune could guarantee. Belonging required inheritance, lineage, subtlety, familiarity with ancient customs, and the ability to express disdain without words. A new money magnate could buy a mansion, a carriage, rare art, custom clothing, and a seat at the opera. But a seat at the aristocratic table, that required time, generations, patience. Wealthy Victorians lived inside a gilded fishbowl, glittering, expansive, exquisitely decorated, and equipped with constant spectators. To be wealthy meant to be observed at all times, by your peers, your servants, your rivals, the press, your extended family, the neighbourhood, and occasionally complete strangers who felt entitled to inquire about your moral standing, your household budget, and whether your children's posture reflected proper upbringing. You weren't important because you were watched. You were watched because you were important. Anonymity was a luxury the wealthy could not buy. In fact, the more money you possessed, the less privacy you were permitted. Every action became a public performance piece, even the actions that were supposed to be private. People noted how you stepped out of your carriage. They noted how you greeted your host. They noted how you held your teacup, how you managed your children, how you arranged your furniture, and whether your curtains were drawn at socially appropriate hours. Nothing was too small to be interpreted, analysed, or repeated at the next afternoon tea. A wealthy Victorian household operated as a hub of visibility. Servants, who formed the silent machinery of elite living, witnessed everything. They saw arguments, disappointments, triumphs, fainting episodes, misplaced letters, fashionable indecision, and late-night snack attempts that contradicted dietary advice. Servants weren't supposed to gossip, but they were human, and gossip was the social glue of the Victorian world. Even the best-run household could not contain all its secrets, when half the secrets involved people passing through corridors with trays. Then there was the public. Newspapers multiplied rapidly in the 19th century, and the wealthy provided irresistible content. Fashion reporters catalogued what elite women wore to public events. Society columns described who attended whose dinner. Gossip journals speculated on marriages, scandals, fortunes, and the quality of the champagne served at various parties. Public interest was voracious, and editors knew it. A wealthy family might find their private affairs real, exaggerated, or entirely invented, printed for all to see. Even philanthropy came with publicity. Donate to a cause and your name appeared in a subscription list. Attend a charity ball and your presence was reported the next day. Host a fundraising event and the city would know what flowers you used, which guests attended, and whether the musicians performed adequately. Charity events doubled as surveillance opportunities disguised as benevolence. But the scrutiny didn't stop at public appearances. Wealthy Victorians were monitored socially as well. Visits were tracked, invitations compared, and absences noted. If you declined too many events, society whispered that you were in financial trouble. If you accepted too many, society whispered that you were desperate for approval. Your every move had an implication, and the implications multiplied the moment you stopped paying attention. Servants were not the only ones observing. Neighbours measured each other's rhythms through subtle cues: carriage activity, garden upkeep, household noise levels, and the timing of deliveries. If a household suddenly increased its orders of coal, grocery staples, or floral arrangements, people constructed theories. Were they hosting an important dinner? Entertaining a potential suitor? Overcompensating for something? A Victorian neighbourhood could interpret coal consumption with the intensity of detectives analysing clues. Even travel made you visible. Depart at the wrong hour, with too few trunks or too little fanfare, and people speculated. Arrive home earlier than expected, and rumours blossomed like mould in humidity. Servants at train stations observed who boarded first-class coaches. Fellow passengers scrutinised luggage quality. Public presence was unavoidable, and every detail became material for someone's quiet analysis. And within your own home, privacy became theoretical. Children were supervised constantly. Spouses were expected to behave as representatives of the household. Personal letters passed through multiple hands before reaching their destination. Rooms were rarely truly empty. Someone was always cleaning, delivering coal, adjusting lamps, polishing furniture, or passing through on some mission. Even moments of solitude were haunted by the knowledge that solitude could end abruptly when a door opened without warning. The wealthy Victorian learned early that surveillance shaped behaviour. They adopted the calm, controlled exterior that society demanded because they knew eyes were everywhere. They planned conversations. They moderated tone. They rehearsed reactions. Emotional restraint wasn't just polite. It was strategic, a method of shielding the family from misinterpretation. Being watched encouraged an internal censor that never slept. But the most exhausting form of surveillance came from one's peers. People attended events not to connect, but to verify. Who wore what? Who said what? Who whispered to whom? Who looked tired, worried, overly cheerful, suspiciously quiet, or alarmingly radiant? Observing others was a way of monitoring the hierarchy, assessing who was rising, who was declining, and who was pretending successfully enough to stay in place. The wealthy lived under pressure to maintain perfection even when perfection was impossible. A cracked teacup might go unnoticed by normal standards, but for someone under society's microscope, it symbolized either declining fortune or declining standards. A wilted flower arrangement wasn't merely untidy, it hinted at household mismanagement. A stumble during a dance wasn't just clumsy, it suggested poor breeding, weak nerves, or unsuitable footwear choices. Every move carried narrative potential, and society was always ready to supply the narrative. Of course, some people thrived under scrutiny. They curated their lives like exhibitions, designing every appearance, gesture and comment to captivate observers. These were the Victorian celebrities, the dazzling dinner hostesses, the charismatic politicians, the fashionable heiresses. They used visibility as currency, understanding that attention could solidify power. But even they walked a tightrope. Visibility amplified both admiration and criticism. Fame required constant maintenance. In the end, wealthy Victorians lived in a world where privacy was a rumour and anonymity a myth. Their lives were public property disguised as private privilege. They weren't watched because they were extraordinary. They were watched because they were expected to be. To be wealthy in Victorian society was to live inside a paradox so elegant and so exhausting that it defined every hour of your existence. You possessed advantages unimaginable to the majority of people around you. Warm meals, most days, abundant servants, fashionable wardrobes, travel opportunities, impressive homes, and the assurance that your daily survival did not depend on breaking rocks, inhaling coal dust, or operating machinery that had a 50-50 chance of rebellion. The good news? You lived better than almost everyone. The bad news? You spent your life proving you deserved it. Wealth brought extraordinary privileges, but each privilege carried its own obligations, anxieties, and invisible strings. A Victorian aristocrat or industrial magnate did not simply live. They performed life, constantly, carefully, at a standard so high it could induce altitude sickness. Every aspect of existence, from how you greeted visitors to how you arranged your mantelpiece, signalled your worthiness. Appearances were not superficial, they were survival. Your house, for example, was not just a place to reside. It was a monument to your family's standing, a testing ground for your refinement, a stage upon which you displayed the quiet power of wealth. It had to be immaculate, elegant, properly furnished, and bursting with the kind of decorative objects that communicated both taste and budget. But the house did not run itself. Keeping it functional required staff, and staff required management, and supervision, and diplomacy, and discretion, and about 10 layers of polite silence. Living in luxury meant overseeing a kingdom within your own walls. Your wardrobe, too, represented the double-edged sword of wealth. Clothing demonstrated status, elegance, and self-discipline, but also demanded sacrifice. Corsets limited your breathing. Tailored coats stiffened your posture. Layers piled onto layers until the human form was more architectural than anatomical. Fashion elevated you and physically restrained you. The garments that announced your refinement also whispered reminders of your obligations. Education, leisure, manners, travel, dining. Every domain of life brought both comfort and performance. You enjoyed refined meals, but those meals required perfect etiquette. You attended dazzling social events, but those events required vigilance. You travelled to breathtaking places, but each journey carried expectations of learning, networking, self-improvement, and the very public demonstration that you were indeed cultured. Nothing came free. Everything came with rules. Even your children were shaped by these pressures. They grew up in nurseries upstairs, supervised by armies of caretakers, acquiring the polish that would allow them to someday maintain or elevate the family's status. They were raised with love, but love filtered through expectations, through rituals, through layers of emotional restraint and carefully measured encouragement. Every misstep was not simply childish error. It threatened the family's painstakingly maintained facade. Then there was the social battlefield, a place where rivalry disguised itself as politeness. Visits, parties, dinners, charity events, balls, seasonal retreats, provincial sojourns, London seasons, country weekends. All of these occasions showcased your social standing. You mingled effortlessly, even when effort was monumental. You conversed meaningfully, even when meaning was absent. You navigated rooms full of acquaintances who smiled warmly while quietly ranking you in their heads. The pressure was relentless. Wealth offered no armour against scrutiny. In fact, it invited scrutiny. Every gesture, every purchase, every new acquaintance, every public appearance was noted and interpreted. People judged your generosity, your composure, your children's behaviour, your choice of upholstery fabric, the number of footmen you employed, and how often you travelled. Being wealthy meant being visible, and visibility meant vulnerability. But beneath the relentless performance, beneath the layers of etiquette and expectation, something else existed, an unspoken truth that the system itself was fragile. Old money feared irrelevance. New money feared exclusion. Everyone feared scandal. Everyone feared decline. Everyone feared that one wrong step might topple the carefully stacked pyramid of privilege. Victorian wealth created a life that was comfortable but not relaxed, stable but not secure, elevated but not free. You had servants but no privacy. You had status but no ease. You had security, but only if you protected it daily. Yet for all the effort, for all the pressure, for all the icy glances in drawing rooms and the battles fought with calling cards and perfectly arranged smiles, wealthy Victorians did enjoy one colossal advantage. They lived a life of beauty, access, abundance, and opportunity in an age when most people struggled simply to survive. They dined well. They slept indoors. They wore warm clothing. They travelled. They read. They cultivated art, music, philanthropy, gardens, and knowledge. They had the privilege to shape culture, influence society, and imagine futures beyond daily survival. Their existence was not easy, but it was privileged. Their burdens were heavy, but their cushions were soft. Their pressures were enormous, but so were their dining rooms. The wealthy Victorian lived a life defined by comfort, and by the relentless labour of appearing comfortable. They inhabited a world where success required constant maintenance, where public opinion ruled more powerfully than law, where social mobility was a competitive sport, and where the rewards of privilege were inseparable from the obligations bound to them.